Hi, I'm Jay Rasizzi with the Michigan Works Macomb St.Clair Young Professionals Program. I'm here with you today to talk about resume writing. I'm going to share with you a number of tips, techniques, and concepts, basic, intermediate, and advanced, all designed to help you get an edge in what can often be a competitive and crowded job market. The purpose of this workshop is to lay the groundwork for upholding a high standard of resume writing across our Young Professionals program. However, you don't need to be a Young Professionals participant to gain anything from this workshop. Some of you may be looking to enroll, others may be interested or qualified in a different program. That's fine. You'll still gain a bunch of information from this workshop. I also want to mention this is a longer video, so I recommend that you pause and stop as often as you need to. Maybe take 2 or 3 sessions to digest all the information I'm going to present to you today. One of the other purposes of this workshop is to teach some best practice ideas behind resume writing. And I'm going to identify for you during the course of this presentation several golden rules of resume writing while still leaving you as much flexibility in place as possible. Before we dive in, I have a couple disclaimers. Number one, there are so many different options for resume writing. So many different so-called resume experts have input and information to share with you. That's fine. I always encourage people to sort of listen, take what you can use, and leave behind what you can't. There may be times also where you and I need to agree to disagree on certain topics. Maybe you heard that a resume should be done one way from one of the experts that you've used or watched, and maybe I tell you a little bit differently. Totally up to you. There's a lot of opinions about this subject, so I'm going to share with you the knowledge that I've gained throughout 20 plus years of doing this. And once again, I encourage you to take what you find useful and leave behind anything that doesn't work for you. Another disclaimer, there's going to be exceptions to every rule. Just like in life, there's always an exception to the rule. So don't get stuck losing yourself to dogma. Dogma is a set of principles or beliefs that are laid down by an authority figure as being incontrovertibly true. That doesn't apply here. There's lots of ways to do this, and once again, there's lots of exceptions. So what about the golden rule that I mentioned, or golden rules? From time to time, there's going to be exceptions to those as well. If you are a program participant and you think you found an exception to your situation with your particular resume, please discuss it with your career development facilitator or another qualified program staff, and they'll help you kind of reach the best outcome for your particular situation. Let's discuss the purpose of a resume. As you may know, a resume serves as a quick snapshot of the things that you have to offer an employer. Now, anything that you see on this presentation in the gold font, that's going to be one of my golden rules. And in this case, I want to stress that one of the purposes of a resume is to advertise your skills, your abilities, your experience, your training, anything that you have that's applicable to the position you are trying to land. That last part is very important, and we're going to discuss that more later on in this workshop. The third purpose of a resume is to generate interest from an employer. You also want your resume, if possible, and it usually is, to separate yourself from the competition. So you're going to learn a whole number of ways to do that in this workshop. Another reason for having a resume and sending them out is to obtain an interview. That's the goal. And as an added bonus, a well-written resume should always be able to prepare a job seeker for an interview. A lot of the resumes that you've seen, the styles and the way they're taught don't tend to do that. So one of the things that you'll learn if you stick with me throughout this workshop, you'll learn how to develop a resume that literally serves as a cheat sheet, if you will, for your interview. I always advise my clients when developing a resume to think like an employer. So one of the things we have to think about is how long does the average employer spend reviewing a resume? Now, in preparation for this workshop, I did some research, and from the best points that I could find, it's only 6 seconds. Once again, exceptions to every rule. Personally, when I look at a resume, we do a lot of hiring, and I've looked at a lot of resumes. I probably spend more like 30 seconds or so, but generally speaking, you have about 6 seconds to make a good first impression. So in thinking like an employer, we got to ask ourselves, what do many employers look for in a resume? So one of the biggest tips I can give you today is they look for ease of reading. If they're not going to spend a lot of time on it, at least initially, they want to see keywords, job titles, facts that show them or appear to show them that you may be a good fit for the position. They want to be able to see that in an easily viewable, easily accessible format. Bulleted fragments, so once again, that's going to be one of my golden rules for you, the use of bulleted fragments, which we'll talk about and I will show you examples of later in this workshop. And generous use of space and margins help with this. So one of the things I've seen in looking through many, many resumes during the course of our hiring is a lot of people tend to cram a whole bunch of information onto a page or several pages. They don't use margins. They don't use space. Their resume is written sort of like a book. And if you remember, the average employer initially spends maybe 6, maybe 15, maybe 30 seconds looking at the resume. A book is not going to be your best bet for landing that interview. The other thing that I want you to think about as you design your resume is employers are looking for relevant qualifications and achievements. Later on in this workshop, I'm going to share with you a number of tips and techniques to either enhance the qualifications and achievements that you're already discussing on your resume or creating new ones from scratch. So in the course of my preparing this workshop for you, I didn't want everything I'm telling you to come from my 20 years experience. Went online, I found an article from Time Magazine, the link is right there for you, written by a man named Josh Sandberg. And Josh has several recommendations on how to potentially help an employer devote more time to your resume. So one of his recommendations, and I happen to agree with this and all of his recommendations wholeheartedly, don't get creative. Now is not the time to get fancy. Hiring personnel are used to looking at resumes that have a certain format, have a certain general hierarchy. So yes, there's a million ways to format your resume that are acceptable, but what you don't want to do is start getting so creative where you're way off base from what the average employer is expecting in a resume. The other thing he recommends, and this is one of my golden rules, is to put your expertise at the top of the resume, or at least, if not your expertise, or at least what you're seeking. So we're going to talk about that as this workshop gets going, but I do want to mention that one possible exception to this rule might be when dealing with staffing agencies, and we'll get more into that later. Don't make it too long, he recommends. Ditch the photos. No photos on a resume. Don't focus on personal achievements. Now what that means is, you remember you want to keep it relevant to the topic at hand, the job that you're using the resume to apply for. So what Mr. Sandberg means by don't focus on personal achievements is, for example, if you were on the high school football team 8 years ago and football or physical fitness has nothing to do with the job that you're applying for, you want to leave that off your resume. You want to fill it with job-related achievements. He also recommends having it professionally made. So if you're in the Young Professionals program, you're golden because you have a number of staff that are really, really good with writing resumes that you have available to you for free. If you're thinking about joining the Young Professionals program, that's one of the many perks that you'll get out of the program. And if you're not in our program, and you won't be, like I said earlier, I'm still going to share with you a lot of tips in this video to where hopefully it will give yourself an opportunity to really either create a resume from scratch or to strengthen one that you already have. I want to talk a little bit, we're still on sort of the basic stuff. I want to talk a little bit about formatting a resume. So some of you are familiar with the term font size. Font size is measured in points, and it refers to, if you're using Microsoft Word or another word processing document, how small or large your fonts are. So standard font size is 12-point font. It's my recommendation, it's actually one of my golden rules, that you stick with either 12 or reduce it to 11 if you're trying to kind of fight to keep your information onto one page. Maybe you're trailing off just a bit. 11-point font is still pretty readable, and it will usually be enough to get, you know, a resume and a paragraph back onto one page. So use 12, use 11. Here and there, you can use larger. I'm going to show you some examples later where I might increase the font to 14 or 16 for a name or a certain heading on a resume. That's fine. But generally speaking, we want to stick with 12-point font or 11-point font. I'm going to talk today about the use of special fonts on a resume. So bold, italics, underlined font. A lot of job seekers won't use those. They sort of just have all their resume in basic font. I'm going to share with you some techniques later on, and you'll see some examples of how to make use of special fonts to make certain information on your resume really stand out, especially at a 6 or 15 or 30-second glance. Borders, I put a question mark there. You can choose to use a border around your resume if you think it looks good. It's typically a matter of preference. Sometimes it takes away from your usable space if you do use a border. I tend to like it, but there are times where if we're trying to fit a lot of information onto a resume, I may not use it because not using a border allows me to lengthen the margins and get a little bit more space to work with. But if you like a border, use a border. Number of pages. So this is going to be one of my golden rules. Ideally, a resume is one page. And the reason I say that goes back to the fact that many employers don't spend very long, at least initially, looking at a resume. So one page is going to typically be better than 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. However, it's been my experience that 2-page resume is completely okay for many job seekers, especially those of us who have, you know, many years of skills and experience and qualifications to show off. A 2-page resume is fine. Just make sure you're not repeating yourself over and over again. Make sure all of the information on it is important and unique. Common headings. I'm going to talk in this workshop about some common headings on a resume. These are things like objective, if you choose to use that. I'm going to show you a better way, though. Profile, qualifications, skills and abilities, education, work history, employment history. They're different ways of saying the same thing. So those are some of the common headings you'll see on a resume. We'll get into that a little bit later as well. I'm also going to show you a technique which I would call subheading. So one of my resumes that I'll show you has that on it. Some of you may find using a subheading technique useful. So we'll get to that later as well. One of my most important golden rules is the use of bulleted fragments. Now, many of you, if you're familiar with resume writing, you're already doing that. A bulleted fragment is actually just what you're seeing on screen here with that little round circle and then a fragment after it. You want that on your resume because to not have that means you're sort of writing that book that I mentioned earlier where people are writing huge chunks of information, which defeats the purpose of a resume. You want your resume to just be short, sweet, to the point. Don't overload it. I also want to mention with bulleted fragments, typically you won't have any ending punctuation after that bullet, so no periods. I'll show you some examples of that too later. Graphics, question mark. Should you have graphics on a resume? In my opinion, 9 times out of 10 or more, the answer is no. So there could be exceptions to the rule, like there is for once in a while for everyone. For example, maybe you're a graphic designer and you wanted to show some custom border work or something on your resume. I don't know, maybe that's an example of when you might want to use a graphic. But a lot of times you'll have a separate portfolio for that kind of stuff. So generally speaking, try to stay away from the graphics. I've seen resume template makers that, for example, someone's going into childcare and they use this template to create ABC building blocks around their resume. And at first glance you think, oh wow, it looks really cool and it looks really relevant. But what you're really doing, in most employers' opinions, you're kind of creating a more distracting resume. You're taking the attention away from the content on your resume and making them look at building blocks. Let your skills, your abilities, and your qualifications speak for themselves. You typically want to stay away from graphics, in my opinion. And less is often more. So once again, don't be the person that writes that book and uses it for a resume, because most employers aren't going to take the time to read that book. So there's something I want to talk about that I call the short stack. I've interviewed employers about their hiring habits, and a lot of them seem to have this in common. Now, I will say this, some companies, particularly larger companies, use like computer software to scan and filter resumes. In our Young Professionals program, we generally don't see that at all. So I'm not going to get into that in this presentation. What I'm going to focus on are those companies that tend to use HR or hiring managers to kind of really physically look at your resume. A lot of employers will tend to take a quick look at your resume and every other resume they're receiving. And if they quickly, in that 6 seconds or 15 seconds, like what they see, a lot of times they put it into what we call the short stack, where they'll review it in a little more detail and spend a little more time on it at another time. So you want to try to get your resume into the short stack. So how can I help you right now and give you some tips to do that? Well, one of the biggest tips I can give you is, one of my golden rules is use a resume, always use a resume that's customized and relevant to the job that you'll be applying for. I always tell people, just like a mechanic would need to use the right tool for the job, a job seeker needs to use the right resume for the job. Now, what some of you may be thinking at this point is, but I'm looking for 2 or 3 or 4 different kind of jobs. Well, I think you beat me to it. You need 2 or 3 or 4 different kind of resumes. I'm going to show you how to do that in this training. But make sure your resume is customized to the job that you'll be applying for. The other thing that's going to help you get into the short stack is you want to always keep in mind the topic of relevancy. So relevancy revolves around your skills, your knowledge, your qualifications, and all of those things are affected by time. To share an example with you, I've run into job-seeking clients who, on their clerical resume, start talking about their experience with Windows 95 operating system. Now, those of us that are a little tech savvy know Windows 95 is really old, really outdated, And showing it on your resume, referring to it on your resume, will make you look outdated. It will make your skills look outdated. So in the event that that is genuinely your last exposure to Windows, you haven't used the latest version, we really need to help get your skills upgraded so that you can create a resume that is more competitive in this market. Another example of something, a skill or qualification that would be affected by time would be an expired or outdated certificate. You know, maybe you had a CNA license, but it expired years ago. That's really not something you can draw from unless you can perhaps there's an employer out there that is looking to hire a CNA, a certified nurse assistant, that doesn't require the license. They'll train and get you that license. In that case, I might refer to your expired license just to show them that you had it at one point, so it'll be easier for you to get it again. Once again, exceptions to every rule. You got to look at your particular situation. One last example would be maybe you attended an hour-long workshop or training like 10 years ago and you got a certificate out of it. Probably don't want to put that certificate on your resume if it was that long ago. From a time standpoint, I'd focus on things that were in the last few years, because especially something short like an hour-long class that you attended, time is definitely going to affect the relevancy of that type of stuff. I also advise people to, whenever possible, avoid popular resume writing wizards or templates. Now, I realize sometimes that isn't possible, but the reason I say that is because so many people use those templates that a lot of times your employers are getting hundreds or thousands of resumes for one job. You don't want, whenever possible, you don't want your resume to look like everyone else's. So later in this workshop, I'm going to show you the resume sort of template that I've developed throughout the 20 plus years I've done resumes. Those resumes will look generally similar for any client that I actually help do a resume. It's sort of my personal take on a resume. Just like if you were to work with one of my other staff, their resumes have their own styles. Those are good because even though 10 of our participants might have a similar looking style resume, that's a drop in the ocean when it comes to how many resumes employers are receiving from the general public. Whereas if you use a Microsoft resume wizard or something like that, you're going to look like a lot of other people that are applying for that job. The other thing that I can help you increase your chances on getting to the short stack is by your use of what I call a sales pitch. Some people call it a profile statement, rather than a job objective. And that's a more advanced technique, and there's going to be a good chunk of this workshop that's going to be spent training you on how to do that. If you must use a job objective, make sure it's very specific. We'll get more on that later. So how else can you help your resume get to the short stack? Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I'm going to show you today how to make sporadic use of specialized fonts, bold, underline, italics, to help important keywords on your resume stand out. Use fragments again, and when you use your bulleted fragments, this is one of my golden rules, avoid the use of I, me, or my. Those words lend themselves to you writing complete sentences. Whereas a resume, by design, is supposed to be made up of sentence fragments. I guarantee if you're writing your resume with I, me, or my, you are drastically increasing your chances of writing that book that I was talking about earlier, which you don't want. You want it to be clear and concise and to the point. Stick to one page whenever possible. I mentioned earlier, no more than 2 pages when necessary. Now, exceptions to the rule, I've run into, say, teachers. I've heard in the teaching industry, it's very common to have a 3 or a 4-page resume. The ones that I've seen, though, when I've helped teachers refine their resume, a lot of them are filled with sort of repetition, and it's actually really easy, if we focus our energy on it, to trim it down to 2 pages. I once actually helped an engineer who came to me with a 6-page resume, which from my perspective is virtually unheard of. And we got that 6-page resume into a 2-pager without losing any critical information. So in my experience, it's almost always possible to stick to 2 pages or less. Avoid using graphics, like I talked about earlier, unless it's extremely applicable. That can help you get to that next stage in the short stack. The next thing that we got to decide is what style resume to use. So those of you that know a little bit about resumes or have been through some of the workshops in our program know that one of the styles available to you is called a chronological resume. So each of these styles has some pros and cons. I want to talk about the pros of a chronological resume. So chronological resume allows a job seeker to focus and show your various accomplishments, achievements, and functions that you've had across your entire work history. It really puts an emphasis on your work history. Those of you that are watching this who already have a resume, if you look at your resume and it's most of the resume is built off your employment history and maybe some bulleted statements under each of your jobs that show, what you've done on that job, you probably have a chronological resume. It's really good for staffing agencies. I mentioned earlier I would explain that in further. Well, a staffing agency a lot of times has numerous potential jobs that they may want to screen you for or place you into. So they tend to love a chronological resume because it literally, they can look through your work history and it shows them every little thing you've ever done at all of your jobs, so they know what they might be able to fit you into that they have available. Another good thing about a chronological resume is it's the easiest type of resume to create for most of us. And it's also, we're not going to get too much into this in this workshop, but the employers that do use those computer tracking systems, chronological resumes tend to be a little easier read by that type of software. Now, what about the cons of a chronological resume? Well, one is it's not ideal for someone who has changed companies or changed job roles many times. It's not ideal for someone who is trying to change careers, as it focuses sort of heavily on your past experiences and your past jobs when you're trying to get into a brand new career. It also blends in with the pack because many job seekers tend to utilize the chronological format. So that's another downfall of the chronological resume. But most importantly, perhaps, most people who use this type of resume end up making one of 2 huge mistakes: repetition or irrelevancy. So to give you an example, and once again, those of you who are already using a chronological resume, I've run into so many job seekers who are making one of these 2 mistakes. So many job seekers come to me having had 3 of the same type of jobs. So maybe they were a certified nurse assistant at 3 different nursing homes. They did the same type of work, the same type of job duties at all of those jobs. Or maybe you were a cook or a crew member at 3 different restaurants or fast food restaurants. Your job duties oftentimes tend to be the same in that industry. By using a chronological resume, it oftentimes puts you at a disadvantage of making a good solid impression with your 1 or 2 page resume, because you'll end up saying the same thing over and over again if your job duties are the same. You've used half of your resume saying the same thing over and over and over again. Another example of why a chronological resume may not be a good fit for other people is because many other job seekers have had, say, 3 totally different jobs in the past. So if you are a job seeker, and I'll throw it out for an example, one of your jobs, you were a cook. Your second most recent job, you were a landscaper. Your third most recent job, you were a cashier. Those are 3 different kind of jobs, each containing things that may be irrelevant to the job you're trying to get into. So in this case, let's say you had those 3 different jobs and you're trying to apply for another cooking job. A lot of times by using a chronological resume, your 2 out of your 3 jobs are going to appear you're going to be talking about bullet points that are irrelevant. So later on in this workshop, I'm going to share with you how you may be able to fix some of those problems and still use a chronological resume. But generally speaking, I would say most of the job seekers I encounter are probably not good candidates for the chronological resume. There's a second type called functional, and you will see all of these examples later on in this workshop. Functional resume. When I talk about the pros, the first thing that comes to mind is it allows job seekers who may have the necessary skills but not a lot of experience to show themselves in a positive light. A quick example of that is you may never have had a clerical job in your life, but whether it was through high school or college or you just being purely self-taught, you may be completely skilled and fluent with various Microsoft software platforms, and you might be able to type 60 words per minute. You're probably very qualified for that clerical office job. But if you were to use a chronological resume without having any of that type of real experience, you might not paint the right picture that you are qualified. So I'm going to show you later when we look at functional resumes how you can make sure that you are showing off all of those skills regardless of where you learned them. Functional resumes, in my opinion, are also good for someone who's looking to switch over to a different line of work. They're able to emphasize greater detail and explanations about specific skills, while doing the same on a chronological resume will often make it too lengthy. And what I like to show people through the use of functional resumes is a successful functional resume will have trimmed off all of what I call the fat, leaving only the points relevant to the job being sought. It allows you to sort of have your cake and eat it too. And once again, when we look at the examples, I think that'll come through. Now, to be honest, I had to go online because I don't believe there's too many cons in a functional resume. So I went online, I researched it, and here's what I come up with. And you notice this is crossed out. So one of the cons that I've seen so-called resume writing experts talk about is some employers find functional resumes difficult to interpret. Well, with the way I'm going to train you on how to do a functional resume, that is definitely not going to be the case because, like I said a minute ago, anything and everything on your resume, on your functional resume, is going to be very specific to the job and the purpose that you're trying to attract with that resume. So I completely disagree with that con. Another one that I want to shoot down as well, some employers find that functional resumes do not give them the entire picture, so to speak. Well, once again, I'm going to make sure you know how to have a functional resume that tells the employer everything that you've ever done, learned, accomplished that relates to what they're hiring for and why they would want to interview you. Another one that I found online that I disagree with is it said many employers are more interested in one's experience or the organization that one has previously been employed with. Well, on our functional resume, I'm still going to show the employer the organizations that you've been employed with. And we're definitely going to show them every little bit of experience that would be relevant to them in any way, shape, or form. So I think there's two more cons. This one, I definitely agree with. It may not be appropriate for staffing agencies for that reasons that I mentioned earlier. So if you're a job seeker that's looking for a job with a staffing agency and a job with private employers, you may need a chronological resume that you'll use for staffing agencies. And if you're better suited for a functional resume, maybe a functional that you use for others. And the last con of a functional resume, it is a little more difficult to write than a chronological resume. But for those, again, for those of you that are in the Young Professionals program, it's not a problem because you have a whole team of experts at your disposal to help you out. The third type of resume is called a hybrid, or some people call it a combination resume. And the pros of that is it kind of allows you to have some of the benefits of a chronological and a functional. It's good for students. It's good for job seekers with limited work experience or volunteer experience. But the bad part of a hybrid resume is they get very lengthy. Since they are sort of a combination of both styles, they'll get lengthy very quickly, and as such, they're probably not suitable for experienced or veteran job seekers. By veteran, I mean seasoned job seekers. Also, they're more difficult to write. It's kind of like a functional resume than a chronological format. All right, I mentioned a little bit back that we were going to talk, I was going to share some information with you about resume headings, or as they are called, headers. These are the sections I mentioned earlier, like your objective or your work experience or your skills or your education, that are all but one or two of those are generally labeled on your resume. So I want to kind of go into that for you. This is what I would label basic content. For those of you that are sort of hungry for some more advanced content, that is coming up, don't you worry. So obviously your resume is going to contain your name, and there's various parts of the page it can go on. I'll show you some examples later. It's going to contain your email address. Make sure you have a professional sounding email address when you use it on your resume. So I have run into clients that have inappropriate or unprofessional email addresses. In that case, I need you to create a new one that you'll use for your job search. And you can still keep your other one, but for your job search, make sure it's very professional. Also, you may want to, in that upper header information next to your name, include any relevant websites. Now, in my experience, most job seekers, this doesn't apply to them. But I have encountered from time to time some job seekers that maybe have a professional Facebook page, not something they use for their personal life, but something that is actually geared towards the work that they've done and the work that they're trying to get with this resume. If you are 100% sure that your social media page is specifically customized to your profession and not your personal life, then you could feel free to add a link to that on your resume. And also I've seen people use LinkedIn, and that's a professional, so kind of not a social media site, but sort of, where you can include your LinkedIn on your resume. Just make sure, as with anything, it's professional and it's geared towards the job that you are trying to land. Physical address, should you not? Well, when I first started doing resumes 20-some years ago, everybody put their address on the resume. It was commonplace. If you didn't, your resume would have looked very strange. Nowadays, you don't need to put an address on a resume. You can if you want. Some job seekers won't put anything at all for that. Some will put just the city and state that they live in. Some will still choose to put their full address. It's really up to you. I just want to stress that nowadays it's not uncommon for someone to not have the address listed on the resume. Telephone number or numbers. Once again, back in the day, it used to be everybody listed a home phone and a cell phone. Nowadays, most of us don't have home phones, so it's okay to just list your cell phone number. Or if maybe you're in a situation where you're not sure if your cell phone is going to stay on for very long, you may want to put a trusted friend's number on there as well. I will mention this though, whatever phone numbers you put on a resume, make sure you have a professional voicemail greeting attached to those numbers. Some job seekers I found, they have something that's completely unprofessional. Well, they should really change that if they're looking for a job and employers may be calling that number. Other job seekers have the general default message where it's not you leaving a message, it's your carrier's general default message. That's okay, but it's not ideal. In my opinion, what's ideal for your phone number is if it's your voice sounding professional, chipper, energetic. Because if an employer does try to call to see about an interview, it's going to give them a strong first impression. So going back for a second, all of that information is what may appear up at the upper portion of your resume. And once again, we have plenty of examples to show you later on in the workshop. So the other thing I have to talk about is, I mentioned earlier, objective or profile, or what I call a sales pitch. We got to talk a little bit about that. This is definitely more of an advanced topic. So you remember the author from Time, Josh Sandberg, mentioned you should always put your expertise and skills at the top of your resume, and that is very true. So you have two options for that. You got what I call your classic job objective, or what some people have termed a profile and what I would call your sales pitch. Most job seekers, you guys, most job seekers by far use a job objective. Well, it's not the end of the world if it's done right. It still is sort of played out. It's sort of cliche. And if you want to separate yourself from the pack, I'm going to show you a way to do that. Before I do that, though, let me talk about give you some examples of bad job objectives. And the amount of job seekers I've personally run across that are making these mistakes is pretty staggering. So it's not uncommon by any means to make this mistake. If you are out there watching and you see this video and you're making one of these mistakes, it's not the end of the world. Just please fix it. I'll help you fix it in this video. So here's an example of a bad job objective. Seeking to utilize skills and experience within a position offering opportunities for advancement. Well, the reason it's bad, and many of you probably already put this together for yourself, is it doesn't tell the employer what you're looking for. And if we think back to the fact that many employers may only spend 6 seconds or a little bit longer, or if you're me, 15 or 30 seconds, glancing at a resume before they decide to put it in the short stack or to shred it or file it, keep it on file for X amount of years and probably never look at it again, they usually don't have time to read this objective and ask themselves, they want a job. Let me see if I have a job that fits them. Like, they don't operate, most employers don't operate like that. Another example of a bad objective, which I've seen time and time again, is it's another objective that's too vague. It doesn't specifically tell the employer what you're looking for. Seeking a challenging and rewarding career opportunity. So both of those, too vague, needs to be more specific. Then the third example of a poor job objective is what I call the TMI mistake, too much information. And you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't, but you might be surprised how often I see this mistake made. So someone may write something like this: seeking to utilize skills and experience as a customer service rep stock person, client advocate, administrative assistant, or office manager. Truly, they would be happy with any one of those jobs. But to send that to an employer, even if they are hiring for one of those jobs, it creates a big red flag in their mind, because I don't know which one of those jobs you like more. I don't know if I hire you for this customer service rep job that I have, if maybe your ultimate goal is to work in an office as an office manager, and you may leave me for a different job once you find it. So it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence from an employer perspective, because really an employer would prefer, whenever possible, to hire someone that wants to work in that type of industry. So don't make that TMI mistake. If that person is really interested in all of those jobs, they need a resume that's geared specifically for each one of those jobs. Some of the content will stay the same, but then there's going to be some customized content that is geared towards one of those jobs, or specifically. Here's an example of a good objective, but before I show it to you, remember, even the best objective is not going to be as strong as a decent sales pitch, and it's definitely not going to be as strong as a good sales pitch. So that's an example of a good job objective, seeking to utilize skills and experience within a full-time client advocate position. It's good because it specifically tells the employer what you're looking for, and hopefully, based on why you sent your resume to that employer, hopefully they're hiring for that specific position. So then at least the employer can say, okay, they're looking for the job that I'm hiring for. But who wants your resume to look like everyone else's? Remember, most job seekers are using the job objective. I mean, it's getting better, but still, a lot of people are taking the easy way out. Why not develop a customized sales pitch instead of that same old, played out, cliched job objective? I'm going to teach you how to do it. So we have our good job objective that I've crossed out here. We're going to change this into a sales pitch. Now, there's not one easy way to do this. There's probably a million ways you could potentially create your own sales pitch. When I'm working with a job seeker, I like to teach them how to research the company, research the job, look at the job description very closely, try to come up with some things that you can offer the employer, as well as some extras that might benefit you. I call it value-added skills, and we'll talk more about that further on in this workshop. But if you can come up with some extra value-added skills to offer them and include that in the sales pitch, keep in mind your sales pitch or your objective is one of the very first things the employer is going to really lay eyes on your resume. So with this particular client, we changed that job objective to skilled client advocate and resource developer. Resource developer was like a secondary part of the job, where after we did our research, we knew that it was the value added part. Like, you didn't have to have it to be this client advocate, but because this person had done that type of stuff before, and after our research, we knew it would be beneficial, we sort of we introduced the job seeker as that. With extensive experience working with diverse age groups, including at-risk and hard-to-serve clientele, possess effective writing and process development skills as needed for grant development and program design. So all of that stuff was specifically chosen because it would be important. It would either be required for the job or it's important to the job. In this case, it was a position for a nonprofit company who sort of lived and died by their grant writing. Grant writing wasn't a part of the job description for the client advocate, but because this individual had experience with grant writing and knew that that experience would be beneficial for this nonprofit employer, we wanted to feature that in the sales pitch to sort of give it a little oomph. You'll also notice that some of the text is in bold font, client advocate, resource developer. Some of the text is in underlined font. If you recall earlier, I said I would show you in this workshop how I make use of specialized font. This is an example of that. So if an employer is quickly scanning through your resume, the things that you have bolded or underlined are going to be much more likely to jump off the page and make sure they see that in the short amount of time that they're scanning it. I have a lot more examples for you because I know this particular example probably doesn't apply to a lot of you viewing. I'm going to share a ton of examples, and hopefully you'll get the knowledge that you need. Here's one. So this is a real objective that a client had once: to obtain a position in education that allows me to utilize both my academic and work experience. Once again, I tend to stay away from the I, me, my, and I recommend you do as well. So we ended up changing this simple objective into a sales pitch that hopefully, if I did my job right, really paints a good, strong picture of the qualifications that this person has to offer. Skilled education coordinator and resource specialist with extensive experience working with at-risk youth and young adults. Possess 3+ years of experience networking with business, academic, and social service providers in order to engage community partners, advocate for youth, and build a network of resource providers. So once again, all of that info was strategically put in there based on that specific job and employer that this person was applying for. And I would like to point out, it looks pretty chunky on this slide, but if it were on a resume, it would obviously be smaller font. We would be able to probably stretch it out and use, in this case, this is a rather long one, I would use probably 3 lines for it. I don't think I've ever used more than 3 lines for a sales pitch on a resume. And most of the time I just use 2. But it depends on your margins and your font size and all that. You'll also notice on both of the examples that I just showed you, I have a little semicolon inserted. I'm not using the semicolon in this exact same way as I would if I were writing a book or a story. It's just the style that I sort of developed. I find it easy I like to include at least like usually 2 separate sort of thoughts in my sales pitch. And the semicolon is just a tool that I use to just maybe divvy them up to separate them a little bit. So once again, you can take that advice or leave it, but it works for me. Here's some additional examples of using an objective versus a sales pitch. So we have seeking a long-term position in a professional daycare facility. Here's the sales pitch version of that. Now this is something I sat down with a client. We really had to talk about it to develop. You can potentially do it on your own, or if you're part of our Young Professionals program, you have staff that can help you develop the sales pitch as long as you have some good starting points and ideas. Or if you don't, maybe they can help you get those. So we changed this to skilled child care provider with 10 years of experience operating a home child daycare, caring for children ages 1 month to 14 years, certified in CPR and first aid, and available to work any days or shifts required. This was one of my PATH clients from a while back. This is an actual real-life example. And after we discussed it, I found this to be just a tremendous boost in her resume. So first of all, I want you to notice the bold words. So child care provider, that's the type of job we're sending these resumes to for her. CPR and first aid are bolded, so they quickly jump off the page. We wanted to specify to a potential employer what the age ranges that she had experience caring for. And notice the end of it, available to work any days or shifts. In many industries, there's multiple shifts. There's, could be 3 shifts. As a job seeker, the more flexible you are, the more benefit you're going to be able to provide to the employer, the more likely they are to want to interview you. So I always say, if you have it, flaunt it. And in this case, if you have a very flexible availability, you want to always show it in your resume, assuming the job you're looking for has more than 1 shift. Okay? So you could show it in your sales pitch, or you could show it in a skill bullet or a qualification bullet. You'll see examples of that later. Here's another one. These are all real-life examples from previous clients from different programs different Michigan Works programs that I've been with. We had a client using a fairly good job objective as far as job objectives go, seeking a full-time certified nurse assistant position. At least it's specific, you know. But we ended up, after a little bit of conversation, changing it to reliable and energetic certified nurse assistant capable of working any shift and providing quality patient care. Now, I don't think this is as strong of a sales pitch as the previous ones that you saw, but in my opinion, it's still better than a classic job objective. The reason it may not be as strong in my eyes is providing quality patient care is sort of a very vague statement. And we better, if we're going to use it like we did, we better back that up with our skill bullets or our qualification bullets in the later part of the resume. But in and of itself, it's kind of weak because you could choose to believe them or not, and there may not be any proof. You want there to be proof if you're going to say something like that. Another example, seeking to utilize excellent cashier skills and experience for the benefit of an employer. This is a real objective that a client came to me with. After I worked with her, once again on her resume, this will not appear so large and chunky. It'll be like 2 lines. Experienced cashier, able to combine elements of customer service, numerical aptitude, and efficiency, leading to increased customer satisfaction, accurate cash drawers, and prompt service. The way we came about this is I really asked her to keep the spirit of think like an employer. What is the employer going to be interested in this industry? And to get her started with her sales pitch, I said, hey, why don't you come up with 3 really strong skill sets you have, really important to the job you're looking for, and then tell me what each of those skill sets is going to lead to. So for example, in this, the customer service leads to increased customer satisfaction. The numerical aptitude leads to accurate cash drawers. The efficiency leads to prompt service. So this is just one idea that I'm sharing with you to kind of get you thinking about how to develop a sales pitch. It's one of many. If you like that idea, try to use it. If you don't, let's use something else. Let's think of something else. There's no one way to do this. Here's another. Experienced cook seeking restaurant employment. I tried to use that same exact technique as I just described with this person, where, give me 3 things and what they'll lead to. She gave me the 3 things, but she couldn't really come up with what they were going to lead to, so we went off in a different style. Experienced cook, trained in culinary arts, nutrition, and proper sanitation. Notice the semicolon I threw in there just to kind of separate the 2 thoughts. Able to provide elements of creativity as well as follow recipes by the book. I don't love it as much as I do the previous one, but I still think it's heads and tails above the job objective that she came in with. And also, the reason for that statement about creativity and by the book is the culinary training that she was in. Her instructor praised her all the time about her abilities to be creative when needed and to follow the recipes really strictly when not, when that's called for. So this is also a talking point. Not only is it on her resume, but it's something that she can share a story during a job interview should she get one. Or I should say when she gets one. Here's an interesting one. So I do want to tell you right now that many of the examples I show you are not perfect examples. They're sort of real life examples, or they have certain flaws. This is an example I'm about to show you for the sales pitch that it contained a lot of good ideas, but in and of itself, it's an example of what not to do when creating a sales pitch. So we have skilled retail manager seeking a retail position with opportunities for advancement. We wanted to change that into a sales pitch. So the participant came up with this. And First of all, it's all bolded, so it's really hard to read. When you use those specialized fonts, bold, underline, italics, you want to use them sparingly so that it actually draws certain powerful keywords off the page. If we use it all in one, it defeats the purpose. The reason I'm including this for you is because she actually had a bunch of great ideas that we could potentially use, and we did sort of refine the sales pitch as time went on. But altogether, it's sort of information overload. Some of the good ideas, though, you can see for yourself. She mentioned that she's extremely flexible. She's willing to work any shift, any position. She talked about her customer service skills. She talked about security skills, which may or may not be relevant to the job. I mean, it may be because the retail industry obviously has, shoplifting is a big thing, retail fraud is a big thing. So if she has those skills, that might make her marketable, but we have to figure out how to refine the sales pitch and sort of target it a little more specifically. So once again, I wanted to include that as an example of some good ideas, but maybe not the best execution. Here's a summary in case you want to take a screenshot or a photo for your use. It just sort of incorporates the basics of the three bad examples of an objective, a good objective, or an even better route, a customized sales pitch. So remember now, we're talking about the headers that appear on a resume. So we had your personal information. We have your objective if you choose to go that route. If you choose to use a sales pitch, you don't need a header on the resume. It doesn't need to say sales pitch. It doesn't need to say profile. It can just contain the information. And when I show you the examples later, you'll see what I'm talking about. Your next heading could be, depending on what style resume you're using too, is qualifications. Now, qualifications are the backbone of a functional resume. But even if you're using a chronological resume, and if you're using a hybrid resume, you can still incorporate what I'm about to show you into any type of resume. So, golden rule for your qualifications section, which doesn't necessarily have to be called qualifications. Some people might call it skills/abilities, or there's so many ways to do it. It should include anything and everything as long as it's relevant to the job target that your resume is being created for. So once again, you always want to customize to a particular job, sometimes even to a particular employer. When you're doing your qualifications section or your skills section, be aware of the risks of potentially coming off as under or overqualified or interested in a different line of work, and customize accordingly. So, for example, if you had sort of a master's degree in accounting, but for whatever reason, and it could be many reasons, that's not the type of job you're trying to use this resume for. Maybe you're just trying to get your foot in the door in a more basic or entry-level opportunity right now. For us to include your master's in whatever business or accounting on your resume would probably paint you as extremely overqualified. When an employer sees that, their first thought is you're not going to stick around, and turnover is the enemy of most employers. They don't like it. They don't like to hire and train and put time and energy into someone only to lose them for a different job. So be aware when you're creating and designing your resume, you may want to leave certain information off that you would have put on a different resume for a different job or employer, but in this situation it might make you look overqualified. Also, if you created your resume and you're looking at it and you're like, man, I look really underqualified, I'm just missing some things. If you're in our Young Professionals program, that's one good thing we can potentially help you with. Talk to talk to your career counselor, your case manager, your CDF about what types of training opportunities could potentially be available to you, and maybe there's a way to develop your skills, or maybe we can do some work-based training, some job experience opportunities too. And if you're in another program, perhaps that program offers similar opportunities. So just be aware if you're overqualified, if you're underqualified, if you don't want your resume to show that. You can list your qualifications in a standard bulleted format. I would always recommend that your most important qualifications go towards the top, because employers may not read every single one of them. They're more likely to read the ones towards the top. Or I will show you an example of using like a subheading in your qualifications section. So there are 4 categories of qualifications for you to consider when creating a resume. And once again, these tips I'm about to share with you are going to be useful no matter what style of resume you choose to use. So here's the 4 categories: job-related, value-added, self-management characteristics, and transferable. Now, transferable will also sort of fall into one of the top 3 categories. There's 3 main categories, and then the transferable can be attributable to any one of the top 3. A transferable skill is something that you've learned in a completely different setting that will be relevant to the job that you're applying for. I'm going to share with you several examples of qualifications. So a job-related skill, as you can see on this Microsoft Word document that I have, a job-related qualification or skill is something that is directly relevant and related to the job that you're about to apply for. So if you're a cashier, 3 years of experience operating cash registers, handling payments by cash, check, credit, debit cards, and vouchers, that is a job-related skill. And you see it's in a bulleted format. It's a fragment. It doesn't have a period after it. We don't typically need ending punctuation after a bullet because it is designed to be a sentence fragment. Having strong customer service skills with a focus on customer satisfaction is a job-related skill. Maybe we talk about, this person's knowledgeable in hardware from experience with such and such company and is able to utilize that experience to answer customer questions and provide product information. That's only usable if they were applying for that type of, like a hardware store or somewhere where they sell hardware. But that would be a job-related skill. 2 examples for a cashier. Here's 2 examples for a receptionist job. Trained in using multi-line telephones to answer screen and forward calls or take messages as needed. Advanced knowledge of Microsoft Office. Now, I'm going to pause that. Most resumes that I see will sort of stop there. They might just say, hey, I got Microsoft Office skills, or I'm proficient or skilled in Microsoft Office. When I teach clients to write resumes, I'm always teaching them how to provide examples, provide something that an employer can sink their teeth into when they're looking at the resume, because otherwise they have to take your word for it, So you want to give them a little extra. Most of your competition won't be doing that. So by you providing those examples, especially in a way that you know that it's going to be useful and relevant to the job you're applying for, that's going to strengthen your resume tremendously. So instead of just saying advanced knowledge of Microsoft Office, we put able to develop presentations, schedule and manage appointments, create materials and format documents, build templates, build databases, create and maintain spreadsheets, including the use of formulas and pivot tables, and much more. So that's just one example of how to really refine your skill bullet. Now, a value-added skill, which was on the previous slide you saw, was that's something that I sort of alluded to earlier, where A value-added skill or qualification is not absolutely needed to qualify for the job. It's something that because you have it, you're going to be in a better position to compete for that job than a lot of your competition. So in my experience in working with job seekers, oftentimes if a job seeker can come up with one value-added skill or qualification, they're doing really well. You know, a lot of job seekers, unfortunately, they think and think and think and they don't have any. But if you have one, great. If you have more than one, super impressive. Here, I'm going to share a couple examples with you by scrolling down. Examples of value-added skills and qualifications. So here's two examples for just about any customer service job. Bilingual, fluent in both English and Spanish. Now, think about this though. If the job you were applying for, let's say it's a gate agent or a ticket agent at the airport, if the job description tells you that, you know, in order to qualify for this job, you must be bilingual, you must be fluent in Spanish and English, then it ceases to become a value-added skill. It becomes a job-related skill. You know, it's something specifically needed for that job. But in many jobs, in many customer service jobs, it could be at a clothing store in a neighborhood where some of the customers do speak Spanish. Your bilingual ability, if not required for the job, is a strong value-added skill that could potentially separate you from your competition. You know, if you're sitting in an interview and you're asked, so I have 10 people interviewing for this job, why should I hire you over your competition? If they ask you that question or a similar question, if you have value-added skills, there's the time to bring that up. You know, not only am I familiar with customer service and cash register and everything that my competition probably has, but I'm also fluent in 2 languages. And if you have Spanish-speaking clientele, I can assist them easily. So another example that I have on here is extremely flexible, able to work any days or shifts required. Believe me, not every job seeker can work any days, any shifts when there's multiple shifts to be had. If that does apply to you, that's a huge value-added skill that you have, or qualification that you have to offer an employer. So here's a couple examples of a value-added skill or qualification for a restaurant job or food service. Possess current first aid CPR certification. Notice that I didn't stop there. I could have. Most people probably would, but I want to explain to this employer why that is relevant or why it could be relevant to them. So we added on, trained to provide support in the event of choking, seizures, or other emergencies. So once again, if you're applying for like a cook job at a restaurant or a fast food, I don't think I've ever seen a job description saying you must have first aid and CPR for this to work at this restaurant. But because you do, you see how it provides you a little bit of extra value that most of your competition doesn't have. Another example of a value-added skill for a restaurant job would be received de-escalation training with such and such company, one of your past employers, to help resolve potential customer issues in a way that promotes satisfaction and continued business. So once again, this is an advanced technique. I want you to note that we didn't just stop with received de-escalation training. In our bullet, we show the employer, we tell the employer how this could potentially be a benefit to them. Also, if you recall from earlier in this workshop, I promised you that a well-written resume, I think at the time I said functional, but it really could apply to any type of resume. If you use bullets like this, it serves as a cheat sheet for a potential interview. So if you have a well-written resume, you can look at these bullets before an interview and you kind of lock into what you should probably be discussing, what you should be focusing on in the interview. You can also if you come to an interview in person and you're handing out copies of your resume or you're offering them to the people in front of you or person in front of you, as you should, leave the rest of your copies right there in front of you. And I don't want you to read from them during the interview, but if you know your resume well, you'll sort of know where things are at. And if you do find yourself getting stuck on a question, it's pretty easy to just say, as you're answering the question, look them in the eye and say, oh, as it states here on my resume, and then quickly look down, get the information you want locked in, and then look back at them and finish your answer. So that's completely acceptable. The next category we had was the self-management characteristics. So these are things that I consider sort of a dime a dozen. We could probably be here for a full hour. If we were together in the same room talking, we could probably list hundreds upon hundreds of these self-management characteristics that people use on their resume. So some examples are things like quick learner, honest and dependable, strong leadership skills, or some people might just say leadership or excellent leadership, punctual, organized, hardworking, physically fit, team player, willing to go above and beyond. So the possibilities here are endless, but what I want to stress, this is so important, is don't make the same mistake as most of your competition is making on their resume when they're dealing with these, what I'm calling self-management characteristics. Most resumes I see that have these types of things on them don't provide examples. So once again, just like I said earlier, you want to give the employer something to sink their teeth into when you're talking about these types of things, because most of the time they haven't met you. You're a piece of paper to them at this point, or an emailed resume that they're looking at on their screen. They don't know you. So I would ask you to put yourself in their situation. If you had your own business and you wanted it to be successful and you needed to hire a couple people to make that happen, are you going to automatically believe that the person that you're looking at their resume and they say they're a quick learner or they're honest and dependable, are you going to automatically take their word for it without ever having met or talked to them? Probably not, right? So you need to expect the same from an employer. Remember, think like an employer. So some of you might be watching this now and thinking, well, dang, I shouldn't be using these types of things on my resume because it doesn't really help me. Well, that's not what I want to tell you. I want you to use them, but I want you to back them up with specific examples to give the employer some confidence. So let me share with you some examples of how you could potentially do that. So I'm going to pick a couple off the top of my head. If you're advertising yourself as a quick learner, if you were my client and we were working on your resume together, I'm always going to ask you questions. I'm going to say, so what makes you say that you're a quick learner? Or, give me an example of you using this, being a quick learner on a previous job. I can remember one of my clients who was faced with this particular question told me, and it took a little bit of thinking and a little bit of conversation, but she told me, hey, on my last job, I worked at such and such grocery store, and I got hired in as a cashier, and 3 months later, I was promoted to head cashier. So I seized on that, and we used it on her resume, but instead of just saying bullet point quick learner, we put something like bullet point quick learner, semicolon, like I like to use to divide two thoughts. And then we elaborated with something to the effect of was promoted from cashier to head cashier after only 3 months at such and such company. So if in this case we were using a functional resume, so our skills or qualifications was the highlight of the resume, we needed to say what company that came from. Whereas if we were using a chronological resume, the bullet would be right underneath that company, so we wouldn't have had to specify. You'll see this later when I show you the examples of the different resumes. Let me give you one or two other ways to deal with these self-management characteristics though. Honest and dependable, the next one on the list. I get a lot of clients who want to say something to that effect on their resume. But remember, once again, we can't just say it because no one's going to automatically believe you, or they shouldn't, right? They're going to want a little proof, or at least something that they can start digging into as proof. So a lot of times when I get this, I ask the job seeker, is there any specific things you've done on a past job or any responsibilities to where we can show that your employer probably by giving you those duties felt you were honest or dependable. And in many cases, I've had job seekers who had responsibilities on previous jobs to handle or to make deposit cash drawers, balance and deposit them. So we might include that explanation in our bullet. Honest and dependable, semicolon, was entrusted to deposit in excess of $3,000 per shift while employed at such and such company. And once again, if they're using a chronological resume, they don't need to say where they were employed at because the bullet will go right under the job. I've had other clients who were like a key holder for a job. Like they said, hey, at my last job or my last two jobs, I had a key to the building and I was entrusted to open or close. Well, that's something we can use to back up that honest or dependable bullet, all right? So you see how it takes a bullet like we're looking at now, honest/dependable, which sort of meaningless, and all of a sudden, by adding those examples, it makes it have carry some weight. Not to mention, if your old job is still in place and your supervisor's still there, the employer might even be able to do a reference check to verify that what you're telling them is the truth. So always, always, always use examples when you use any type of self-management characteristic. I'll see if I can give you another one real quick. So if you were to talk about you being organized, you'd want to think back on a job or a recent school situation, if that applies to you, to think about a time where you really, really, really had to go above and beyond with your organizational skills, and maybe use that information to create a bullet to give them a little bit of an example of, so that they can believe you when you say you're organized. If you are punctual, you're always on time, you never miss a day of work, that one tends to be sort of hard to prove with an example. The one way that I've found success in the past is if you have or can obtain a letter of reference from your current or your past supervisor, or maybe two supervisors, and get them to put in the letter how you were never late, you were super reliable, you were always on time, you never missed a day of work. If you can get a letter of reference that says that type of thing, you might be able to put, punctual and reliable, and then for your bullet, and then in parentheses you could say something to the effect of possessed letter of reference from past supervisor or from past two supervisors supporting this statement. Now that adds a lot of confidence to when an employer looks at that bullet, because they're thinking, all right, I can check up on this person. I can talk to their supervisor. I can read their letter of reference. So it adds some credibility. It adds some weight. If you're going to use team player, you want to maybe think of an example about maybe on one of your past jobs or in your recent past school event, you were picked to sort of, lead up a team building event or something like that. So the moral of the story, you guys, and I know this is an advanced technique, it takes some time and it takes some effort to do, but you want to back up all of these self-management characteristics with examples in order to properly use them on a resume, and most importantly, to just separate yourself from your competition, many of whom are not going to be using this technique on their resume. I mentioned transferable skills can kind of go with any of those job-related value-added self-management. It just happens to come from a different opportunity. I wanted to just share with you some examples of transferable skills. I realize that not all of these, or maybe not any of these, might be directly applicable to you in your situation, but I'm hoping that if that's the case, you can at least read and kind of learn from them and how to get an example that is directly applicable to your situation. So transferable skill is a skill, it may be a skill learned from being a greeter at a grocery store or a host or a hostess at a restaurant, can be transferred over on a resume geared towards a receptionist position. You see, because both jobs, even though they're totally different arenas and industries, both of them involve people skills and working with people. So you could take your experience from your greeter or host or hostess position and sort of create a skill bullet that's applicable to a clerical resume or receptionist resume. Leadership skills, well developed working in a warehouse, can potentially be transferred to use on a resume to just about any job where leadership skills are required, even though it came from a different industry. Maybe you're talking about how you were responsible for supervising 6 employees and handling scheduling and timesheets and all that. That can kind of transfer over to other jobs, to other industries. It may be a job-related skill, depending on the job description. It may be a value-added skill if it's needed but not required, and you know how to do it. But bottom line, it came from a completely different industry, so I'm going to call it a transferable skill. 2 more examples: typing or software skills that you learned in school or you self-taught can be transferred over to use on a resume for an office clerical type of position. And the resume that I know it says I'm going to show you a resume for a cable field technician employee. This resume was made up, as you'll see later, is made up almost entirely of transferable skills. So I'm going to show it to you. You'll be able to look at it whenever you need to, just access this video, and you'll be able to familiarize yourself with this technique of how to create a resume for a job that you have skills for potentially, but you've never actually done before. All right now I'm going to switch back to our PowerPoint and go over a few other things with you. So the art of resume writing, well, I kind of call this, I crossed out resume writing. I call it, when I train my staff on resume writing, I call this the art of interrogation. I'm going to show you a bunch of tips that I would normally train my staff on, just to kind of get you thinking in the right way to help develop your resume. And these tips are going to be useful when thinking about what kind of skills and qualifications you might have to offer an employer. I know from experience that many of you out there viewing this video maybe just have a very short list of skills right now. I'm pretty confident that we can help you expand on those skills. So here's some tips on how to start thinking about that. To get the most out of a participant resume, my staff are trained to ask questions and follow-up questions when assisting someone with their resume. Some of the questions we ask you will yield instant results. By results, I mean something that we can instantly create a bullet for your resume. Others, we might ask the question, and the answer we get, we're like, okay, well, it's good, but we can't use it for the resume. So we got to keep trying, and I call this drilling down. We ask a question, we don't get a usable answer for a resume, so we sort of ask again in a different way, and we keep drilling down until we get what we need or we try a different approach. I always train staff to ask, whenever possible, ask open-ended questions rather than a yes or a no question. So instead of, for example, did you like your last job? Where you could then say yes or no, and we didn't get anything to put on your resume from that. We would ask, what did you like most about your last job? And then your answer may give us an idea for your resume, may give you an idea for your resume, or we might have to sort of drill down and keep going to get that. I train my staff to ask questions separately for each job in your work history because, once again, even though maybe some of the jobs you've had aren't directly related to what you're trying to get, we might be able to access and develop some transferable skills or some value-added skills by talking about those jobs. Here's some examples. What skill did you learn at, insert the name of your employer, ABC company, that the employer you are applying for now would be interested in? So you at home, thinking about ways to create or improve your resume, take some time to think about that. If you're in the program, feel free to take some time to discuss that with program staff, and they might be able to help you even beyond the ideas that you'll come up with. What was your favorite thing about the job? And I would ask you that probably for every job you've had and try to come up with some ideas. What did you do in your downtime? I can remember asking that of one of our participants who was working at like a food service restaurant type job. And when I asked that question, he goes, well, my manager always says, if you got time to lean, you got time to clean. And so we laughed, and I said, so did you clean? And he's like, oh yeah, every time I had some free time, I was cleaning. And we were able to have a conversation and then use that to develop a skill bullet about, maintaining the cleanliness of the restaurant. Did you learn anything on past jobs that you could use for this job that you're applying for? I ask that question to try to, once again, tap into transferable skills, something you gained from another job that can transfer over to this job and would still be relevant and useful for the employer. You say that you have strong, and then insert whatever self-management characteristics, like what we just talked about, like strong leadership skills. How did you develop that skill? I would ask you to give me an example or two of a time that you used that particular skill on a job to benefit an employer. So you see how these are the questions that are going to get you that extra information for your bullet, rather than just saying you have leadership skills, which they're not going to automatically believe that you have. This is a question that's designed to get you thinking about ways to enhance that bullet, make it stronger, take it beyond what your competition is typically doing. I might ask you, tell me about your proudest accomplishment at such and such company. And your answer, if you could answer that, might yield some information that we can use in a bullet for your resume. How would your supervisor describe you? How will they write you a letter of reference? Here's a good tip that I want to share with you guys for who are, no matter if you're trying to fine-tune or enhance an existing resume or creating one from scratch, I think this will help you. So I always like to have my clients think about these 3 questions. And these 3 questions are all very similar, but they're each worded in a different way, because I find that different people are sort of receptive to different ways of asking a question. So one of the questions I want you to think about is, why are you qualified for this position? The other one, which is similar, why should I hire you over the other candidates being interviewed? And what can you do for me? So if you were sitting in a job interview and you were asked one of these questions, if you've ever interviewed before, you probably are aware that you'd have probably, if I asked you, why are you qualified for this position? You'd have about 1, 2, maybe 3 seconds to quickly formulate an answer and start talking. Anything longer than that, it's going to start getting awkward. Whereas right now, we're working on your resume, right? We have all the time in the world. We have as much time as you want to put into this. You have as much time to think about these questions as you want to put into it. So if you're falling asleep at night thinking about why you're qualified, and you might come up with a few reasons, I'm willing to bet you that those reasons are usable for qualification bullets on your resume. So the best part of it is, remember I said earlier that I'm going to show you how to create a resume, if it's done right, that it actually serves as a cheat sheet to an interview. Well, this is part of the reason why, because when we formulate our bullets through the use of these questions, on a well-written resume, every single bullet that you have on it, especially on a functional resume with your qualification bullets, every one of them you're able to use to answer these questions. So this is a good tool to use to develop some ideas for those qualification bullets. Remember, we're talking about the different headers that can go on a resume. So we've talked about objective or sales pitch. We've talked about the personal information at the top of a resume. We've talked about the qualifications or the skills section of a resume. Now I want to talk a little bit about the education section on a resume, which is commonly part of almost every resume I see. One of my golden rules is, once again, include anything and everything as long as it's relevant to the objective in question. Another rule, be aware of the risk. We talked about this earlier. I just want to re-emphasize it. Be aware of the risks of potentially being viewed as over or underqualified or interested in a different line of work, which sometimes your education section could cause a problem with, and customize it accordingly. So for example, I've run into clients who have a certified nurse license or certificate, but they're not applying, for whatever reason, they're not applying for a certified nurse job. Or maybe they are, but they're also applying for this different kind of job, and they're going to take whatever they get first. If you're applying for a job that has nothing to do with the health field, and you put that valid certified nurse certification on your resume, you're definitely appearing to be potentially overqualified, but at the very least, you're showing yourself as probably interested in a different line of work. For example, I'm a restaurant owner. You're applying to my restaurant for a hostess position or a host position. And I look on your resume and it says you have a certified nurse assistant. As an employer, I'm thinking to myself, well, you've obviously spent all that time and energy and effort into attaining that certificate. You probably wouldn't have done that had you not wanted to go into that field. I mean, I know that there are exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking. So a red flag comes up in my mind, and I'm thinking, you know what, if I hire you as a host or a hostess, you're probably just going to leave me once you find that CNA job. You probably wouldn't even get the opportunity to explain yourself, because I probably wouldn't even call you for an interview. I'd call someone else that seems, at least on paper, on a resume, they might seem to me to be a better fit, like a better chance of sticking around. So be aware of what you're putting on your resume. Make sure it's appropriate. Make sure it doesn't make you seem overqualified, underqualified, interested in a different line of field, a different line of work. So if you're that person, I would recommend for that resume, for that restaurant resume, you take that CNA education off and just don't even talk about it. Just show your diploma or your GED or whatever relevant education you might have, and go from there. Some job seekers that I've worked with can build an entire resume, or at least the bulk of it, from the education section alone. So some of you out there might have you might have undergone a pretty extensive training program and you got certified in something or another, but maybe you've never even done that job before and you're trying to get into that field for the first time. if I were you, I'd be building the bulk of my resume from the education section. Instead of showing it towards the bottom like a lot of people might, I would probably put it right under my sales pitch, and it would be my lead-off section, because if that has the most, shows the most of your qualifications. Everybody's situation's different, and if you're in one of our programs, the staff that you're working with can help you make those decisions. I want to share with you real quick some 6 common scenarios of education, and I'll try to be brief because I know a lot of these won't apply to all of you viewing out there. Some of you are college graduates, so once again, keep the golden rule in mind. If you feel your college degree is going to help you or is required for the job you're applying for, put it on your resume. If you think, though, it's going to make you look overqualified, I'd recommend you completely remove it from that resume and use it on maybe another resume for something that it's more appropriate for. Some college. So if you have a certain amount of credit hours but no degree, I always recommend to clients that on the resume, you might show how many credit hours you have. Like, for example, 46 credit hours, hyphen, the name of the college. You could potentially put your expected graduation date. You could potentially put, and this goes with the college graduate as well, for any of these categories, you could put bullets underneath them. So if you've completed a certain class and you learned some things from that class that you are confident would be very relevant, very appropriate to that job you're applying for, put bullets under the section. And you'll see on some of the resumes I show you in a little bit, you'll see some examples of that. If you don't know, by the way, if you don't know how many credit hours you have, if you have your transcripts, your recent transcripts, you can look on there. Otherwise, you can contact your school, the college you go to, and usually there's a small fee to get your transcripts, but you'll be able to confidently put how many credit hours you have. If you're currently in school and you have an expected graduation date, I would probably put that on the resume and a bullet below, the name of the school and the program or how many credit hours you have, because that kind of lets the employer know, when you'll be graduating. High school diploma. For those of you that have your diploma, not your GED right now, we'll talk about that next. If you have your high school diploma, you can, if it's recent, so remember the relevancy revolves around time. If you're a recent grad, and by recent I'm thinking within 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, no more than that, and you had some very specifically relevant experience from high school that would be relevant to the employer that you're applying to. Maybe you're applying to like a mechanic shop or something, and you had some auto tech classes or things like that. You can feel free to put your bullets underneath your diploma from such and such school and talk about the relevant things that you learned that the employer would find useful. If you graduated a while ago, it tends to not become a good look because an employer sees that you're dwelling on things from 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago from high school, and you haven't really done anything else. It just sort of draws attention to that, and it's probably not a good look. So I would make sure, if it were my resume, that it's relevant from a time standpoint. The other thing I want to explain about those of you that have the diploma, a lot of resumes I see will show the graduation date, the year that you obtained the diploma. Just be aware, if you're not already, that pretty much, when you show your graduation date, it pretty much tells the employer how old you are. Now, they're not dead on. Sometimes they're going to be off by a couple years either way. But for all intents and purposes, it gives the employer a general idea of your age. Now, we all know that age discrimination is illegal. But if there was an employer out there who was a little shady and you happened to apply to them, there'd be nothing to stop them from not giving you a call for that interview because your age is not sort of what they had in mind for that job. Not saying it will happen, but sometimes there are irreputable employers out there. Most of them are not, but some are. So you want to protect yourself. If you feel, generally speaking, that your age is a positive asset, like stereotypically speaking, by all means show the graduation date on the resume. However, if you feel, stereotypically speaking, that your age potentially carries a negative stereotype with it, leave the graduation date off. If you get called for the interview, they still might physically see you're young or old, but at least you have an opportunity to get the foot in the door and explain, why you're right for the job. I'll give you 2 quick examples on that. Early in my career in this industry, I was sent a client who had been applying everywhere and just was never getting any calls back. This client was applying for very physical labor, general labor types of positions. Ditch diggers and things that involved a lot of strength and endurance and physicality. And when he showed me his resume, I could instantly tell why he wasn't getting these calls, because in his education section he showed he had his diploma, and when I did the math based on his graduation date, this guy was like 50, early 50s, 50-something years old. Generally speaking, the stereotypes are going to be not to his advantage for that job. The employers for the type of jobs he's applying to are looking for brute strength, energy, and probably very little else. Whereas when I met him, this guy was a former bodybuilder, and even though he was in his 50s, he was in much better shape than I was, and I was in my 20s at the time. And by one look at him, you pretty much knew he could do this job better than any 19-year-old. But by him putting that graduation date, it was definitely hurting his chances of getting a call for those types of jobs. So we removed it, we tweaked his resume here and there, and he found no problem getting interviews after that. And then once he got his foot in the door, he was able to, one look at him, you knew he could do the job. So he was getting discriminated against inadvertently because of his age, and we fixed that by removing the date. We could have a whole training on that alone, but I'm going to stop there for high school. So use the date if you think your age is an advantage for the job you're applying for, and leave it off if you think it could potentially hurt you. With your GED, the date is not necessarily going to give your age away, because if you got your GED in 2020, you could be 18, you could be 40 for all I know. I'm not going to know. So it doesn't really carry as much of a significance as if you had your diploma. The other section or common scenario on the education section is those of you that may not have the diploma, not have the GED, but you're working on it. You're enrolled in a school or some classes somewhere. So whether this applies to you or someone you know, you can kind of share it with a friend too if you know someone in this situation. If you're in that situation and you're actively enrolled in school and trying to obtain your GED, you can put on your resume GED pending and then the name of the school. You can put bullets that contain, expected graduation date, such and such. You can put, if you've already taken some of the GED tests, but maybe you just have to finish one more, you can have a bullet that says successfully passed X amount of sections, one more section to complete, scheduled for such and such a date. That gives the employer, a potential employer, an idea of how close you are. Also, one other tip I have for you if you're in that situation is a lot of our clients, they want to get a job that's compatible with their GED schedule, and we encourage that because we don't want you to lose sight of your education. So if that's the case, good, and we don't want to waste your time or the employer's time with a job that is going to take you away from your education, which you don't want. So if that's the case, I encourage you to even put a bullet that says, talks about your schedule. Maybe it says, bullet, currently attending classes are currently attending GED classes on Mondays and Wednesdays from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. And I know now we're thinking more of a virtual time now because of this pandemic, but hopefully we'll get back to these physical classes soon as well. So if you put something like that on your resume, it automatically shows the employer what your school schedule is, and they're probably not going to give you a call if that job requires you to work those hours. You know, they're going to be, and it doesn't waste your time and it doesn't waste their time. The last scenario for education is we sometimes get clients that they don't have the GED, they don't have the diploma, and they're not working on it. Now, of course, we'll do our best to try to hook them up with a program where they can work on it. But the fact remains, sometimes a client looks us in the eye and says, listen, you know, I want to eventually get my education, but now is not the time. Like, I need to make some money. I need to do it now. That's my goal. So if that's your situation, that's your situation. The thing is, though, with your education section, don't make the mistake some people do, where I've seen resumes that might say, like, you know, 9th grade education and that's it, or, you know, so it shows the employer that you sort of dropped out, which is fine. It is what it is, right? But we don't want to necessarily draw attention to it. So in that case, I would ask the client, do you have any type of certifications? It could be just a short training class that you attended or something that's relevant to the job that you're applying for. And if the answer is yes, I would have the education on the resume, and all I would do is include those certifications that you might have that would be relevant to the job you're applying for. I would make no mention of high school if you're not, you know, if you did drop out and you're not currently re-engaged in your GED or diploma, I wouldn't mention it. Now, for those of you that don't have the luxury of putting any certifications on and you just don't have anything, I personally feel it's better just to remove the education section from the resume than to say like 9th grade education or something like that. Because otherwise it just draws attention to it. So remove it. My advice would be to remove that section and then send your resume to places that you feel the education or lack of is not going to be a big deal. So that would be my advice for that. Another common section on a resume, no matter what style resume you're using, chronological, functional, hybrid, is the work history section. Now remember, it won't always be called work history. Some people will say employment. Some people will say work history. Some people might say something else, but it basically contains your jobs. So this section becomes the heart and soul of a chronological resume, and it's sort of minimized on a functional. I promise you'll see examples soon. In this section, you can include anything and everything from the past, and I put question marks here on purpose. How many years do you go back? The general rule, not the golden rule, the general rule is if you have 10 years experience, you go back 10 years generally. Obviously, if you don't have 10 years, you're going to go back to whatever you have, 5 years, 6 years, 4 years. But in my opinion on this, remember earlier on I said there's exceptions to every rule when we're talking about resumes and often when we're talking about life. My opinion on this is some of these rules are sort of made to be broken when the situation calls for. So not a lot of our young professionals will run into this, but I'll briefly mention it in case some of you are watching that aren't in our young professionals program. I've run into job seekers that might have 15 years of work experience or 20 years, and they're applying for a certain job that the only relevant experience that they have for that job came from 15 years past. And the first thing we want to identify is, are those skills and knowledge from 15 years ago still relevant today from a time standpoint, or has technology sort of passed them by? If the answer is, yes, they are still relevant and useful, that person has to break that rule of 10 years and go back 15 years in order to show some some relevant experience. They almost have to. And also on the flip side, maybe you do have 10 years of experience, but maybe 7, 8, 9 years, 10 years ago, you were sort of like job hopping and you only had one job for a few months and another job for a few months. Personally, I think you're better off just leaving those off and just using a 7-year work history, even though you could have went 10 if you needed to. So that's just a general guideline. Kind of you want to, as always, you want to use whatever information and rules that are going to paint you in the best light for that job. So I put on this slide that you want to go back X amount of years, providing it won't hurt your chances of being hired. So you always, when you're listing your work history, you always want to think about references, reason for leaving, length of employment, etc. That's literally a whole nother training, a whole nother workshop. So those of you who are in a program with Michigan Works can talk to your program staff and get some further advice on that. I want to mention to you that you could use, if needed, Homemaker or something similar, if applicable, to fill any gaps in your employment or in your work history. So, it is perfectly normal in our society for someone to have a child and to take some time off to, raise the child, or at least until the child is old enough to, be cared for by someone else. And I don't feel there's any shame in if it's true, filling in a gap in employment with Homemaker or another similar label that you're comfortable with. I do want to stress that it is okay, some people think it's not, it is okay to use under-the-table employment or self-employment on a resume. Just remember, hopefully, anything you're showing in your work history, employers can ask you for a reference for, and you can give it to them. I realize there are some cases where you won't. Maybe they went out of business, or the person that you worked for and you were self-employed has since passed away or something. So, of course, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, if you want to use an under-the-table job, you were getting paid cash, use it. Just make sure that your employer, if they're still around, is good with you, using them as a reference, because that's important for your chances of getting hired on for many companies. If you had jobs where you were self-employed, maybe you did hair or you did some landscaping for some people in the neighborhood, or you fixed cars or something like that, it's okay to say, self-employed landscaper, self-employed, hairstylist from such and such date to such and such date. If I were you, though, I would go to your clients and try to ask them to write you a letter of reference, talking about how, reliable or honest or good worker you were, or you are. And so that way, if an employer asks for it, you have it for them. Also, you could maybe use it to back up those, like we talked about before, certain bullets you might be able to prove on your self-management skills, especially by saying in parentheses after the bullet, have letter of reference from former supervisor or from current client or former client proving this statement. So it will benefit you in many ways to make sure that happens. I encourage you to identify reasons for short durations of employment, because your work history is typically going to show either the months and years or just the years of the time you spent with that job. I realize, you guys, that some resume styles that I've seen encourage certain job seekers, especially those that are sort of job hoppers, to not put years on there. Personally, though, to me, that's sort of a red flag. If you don't show the dates that you worked there, I know something's up. I probably would just grab another resume, and you don't want to take that risk unless you have to. So for those of you that did work short-term jobs and there was a good reason behind it, make sure you lower the red flag that comes up in the employer's mind by specifying on your resume, like seasonal, like, maybe you were a lifeguard, or that might be kind of obvious, but maybe you were a landscaper and you only worked from, a few months. you want to put on your resume job title landscaper and then in parentheses seasonal. Or if it was through a temp agency or a temporary assignment, same thing. Put the job title and then put parentheses temporary assignment. That way the employer looks at your resume and is like thinking, okay, they were only there 3 months, but it was a seasonal job or it was a temp assignment. Otherwise, they might be wondering, why only 3 months? Did they quit? Did they get fired? What happened? So you don't wanna, you wanna remove any potential red flags that come up in an employer's mind when viewing your resume. Some of you watching this video will have volunteer experience that you can work with. Others will have self-employment. You can use all of that. You don't have to necessarily have a separate heading on your resume. Like you could put it all under work history or employment history, whatever you choose to call it. It's just if it was a volunteer job, I would, in parentheses after the job title, put volunteer. If you really want to, though, you could have 2 sections. You could have an employment history or work history and then a volunteer history. Either one is fine. If you have 2 sections, though, it's going to tend to take up more space, which, depending on your situation, could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. Golden rule, once again, hopefully you guys know this by now, always ask yourself for anything you put on your resume, including anything in the work history, is it relevant or just taking up space? For example, if you're using a chronological resume and you had all CNA jobs, but you're applying for a cashier job, all the bullets that you put as a CNA, if you focus on your job-related skills for those jobs, they're not going to be relevant. You want to focus then on the transferable stuff or the value added. So that way, you don't make the same mistake as a lot of people make when using a chronological resume, where they're just putting things on their resume that aren't relevant to the employer that they're sending it to. If you left a job on bad terms and you're in one of our programs, talk to your program staff about that, because we can help you figure out the best way to handle that for your particular situation. Should you list addresses and locations, addresses or locations of jobs? Personally, when I look at resumes, I do see a lot of resumes, probably the majority, that come and they usually don't have full addresses, but sometimes they do for employers. But what they almost always they have at least location, so like city and state. I'm not a fan of that. The reason being is, early on in this workshop, I shared with you that you want to have, like, less is more. You want to have some white space, some open margins. When you start filling up your work history with Rochester Hills, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, whatever cities you worked in, it takes up space. And for what reason? The reason I ask that is, almost every job you're going to be applying for, not every job, but almost every job, is going to have you fill out a job app. On just about every job application I've ever seen, it not only asks for the city and state of your former employers, it asks for usually the full address. It asks for phone numbers and contact information a lot of times. So to have it on your resume is sort of, you're jumping the gun. You're really just cluttering it up without any reason, because that information is going to be asked for on a job app. Remember though, exceptions to every rule. From time to time, I get clients who, they have a good reason to break that rule. For example, I once had a client who was part of a certain city, like they live in that city, all the jobs that they've ever had were in that city. They went to school in that city, and they were applying for a city position. So they felt having the names of that city all over their resume was a good thing, and I sort of had to agree with them. Now, it still cluttered it up. It still took up space that I would have rather had look a little nicer, but at least it was for a good reason. So I'm a fan of doing something as long as there's a purpose and a reason behind it. But you guys, in my opinion, I'm not putting a city and state on my resume for my work history, because I just don't feel it serves any purpose to help me get an interview. Now, if you can think of a purpose that it might help you get the interview, then cool, do it. Now, here's the part we've been waiting for. So I'm gonna access some Microsoft Word files, and I'm gonna share with you some sample resumes of different styles. The first resume that we're going to look at is it's an example of a chronological resume. There's several things I want to point out to you, good and bad, as an opportunity for you to learn some tips and techniques and what to do or what maybe not to do on your own resume. I did use a border on this resume, so remember early on in this training I mentioned if you like the border, use it. If you don't have to use it. I have one disclaimer about borders though. When you do choose to use a border around your resume, if you're printing copies, if you're going to be handing out copies or sending them in, physical copies rather than emailing them, you always want to make sure you're printing off a printer rather than making copies of your resume through the copy machine. Because every time you use a copy machine, it's going to take that border and throw it off a little, either up and down or left and right. And the more copies you make, the worse it's going to get. So try to print like a fresh copy right from the printer whenever you're using a border, if you're sending a physical copy or handing it to someone. So I did choose to use a border on this. Remember earlier I mentioned that, generally speaking, you want to use 11 or 12, well, 12 or 11 point font, but sometimes there's exceptions to that rule. So I made the name is a little bigger. I use 16 point font. You can kind of see it right up here. With this sort of sales pitch, it's using a 12 and then the rest is 11. I like to, when possible, I like my sales pitches to be just a little bit bigger, but it's just personal preference. It's not like a rule you have to follow. So notice this, remember we talked about the different headers of a resume or sections. This top one is your sort of your opening header. It doesn't say header on it, but that's where you put your name and your email address, your phone number. You could put your address. Remember, we talked about that earlier. You don't have to, or you could just put the city and state. I'm going to show you some examples that have all of those. This person chose to create a sales pitch rather than an objective. They could have said objective, seeking a warehouse position or something like that. So instead, they have well-rounded warehouse laborer with high-low forklift, shipping and receiving, and quality control experience. Possess own transportation and flexible enough to work any days or shifts. So that's sort of what they felt is their big selling point that they want the employer to see. Notice how we bolded certain keywords to make them jump off the page at first glance. For those, some of the things I put on these examples, you guys, you can potentially make use of even though you're not in the warehouse industry. A lot of you won't be. So, for example, for most jobs, you don't have to have your own vehicle. You just, legally, you only have to have reliable transportation, which could be the bus system. However, as I mentioned earlier in this training, if you have it, flaunt it. If you have your own transportation, the employer would probably appreciate that. So don't be ashamed to put it on your resume if you have it. You don't have to word it exactly like this. You could say, possess valid driver's license and own transportation, or any way you choose. Once again, I mentioned this earlier, if you are flexible enough to work any days or shifts, flaunt it. You don't have to put it up here in your sales pitch. You could put it in a skills or qualifications bullet. On a chronological resume, it would be awkward to put underneath the job duties. That would be more geared towards the functional. So, moving on to the next header is your employment, or what some people might be calling work history or employment history. This person had several employers. And being that this is a chronological resume, you guys, the heart and soul of this resume is your work history, your employment history. So the bulk of this resume is made up of where they worked, when they worked it, and the job duties and essential things that they did on the job. If you guys can recall, early on in this training, I mentioned to you that the biggest mistake, one of the two biggest mistakes people make when they use this chronological format is they tend to either have had the same type of job and they repeat themselves over and over and over again, or they've had jobs that are not relevant at all to what they're trying to get, so they end up using their bullets to talk about things that this new potential employer could care less about. This person in this example did not make either of those mistakes. they're one of, in my opinion, one of the few people who could successfully pull off a chronological resume over a functional resume, although they still could have used functional. So if we were to take a look at this resume, we'll see that the vast majority of their bullets underneath each of their jobs are related to the job target that they have, that they're sending this resume out for. And for the most part, they're not being overly repetitive. They're sort of trying to word things in different ways and not repeat the same things, even though they've had basically all the same types of jobs, like warehouse jobs. They're being creative and selective in their bullets to try to not repeat things over and over again. And they're trying to share things that would all be either job related to this position that they're applying for, or transferable, things like that. Now, here's an example right here how sometimes you find yourself in a job, and notice I didn't name any employers on here, I edited it. Sometimes you find yourself in a job where you've had 2 or more different job titles within this company. I just wanted to include this for you as a way to potentially address that on a resume and show like when you've done what. The other thing I want you to notice is on this particular resume, we don't have months and years, we just show the years. So you got to use whatever format is going to make you look, is going to paint you in the best light. So for some of you, that might be using months and years. For others, it might just be using years. Let me see if I can give you an example. Let's assume that this person left employer B in January of 2017. And then they got hired on with their most recent employer. You should always go most recent to oldest in your work and your education history. They got hired in, let's assume, in December of 2017. So they were actually, in that situation, they were unemployed for 11 months. They have an 11-month gap in their work history. To not draw attention to that, I mean, it's not the end of the world, but why draw attention to something potentially negative if you don't have to? So by leaving the months off of their work history, they were sort of able to hide that 11-month gap while still telling the truth. They did work from 2017 and they did get hired in 2017. It was just January and December. So in that particular example, this person is better served by just putting the years rather than putting months and years. Now, if I could reverse the example, let's just assume now that they left this job, they got laid off or let go in December of 2017, and they quickly got a new job in January of 17. I'm sorry, I had to repeat that. They left this job in December of 2017, and then let's just change this. Let's say they got their new job in January of 2018. If they were just to use years, it would show the end date of 2017, which was really December, and the start date of 2018, which was really January. It would appear then on the resume that they had a full 1-year gap in employment, when in reality, they only had a 1-month gap. So in that case, it would definitely be better for that person to include months and years. So you guys out there, you got to decide, look at your overall work history and decide which works best for you. Just the years or the months and the years. Just realize though, those of you that are just choosing to use just the years, when you fill out a job app, which you often will have to do, many job apps will ask for the months and years, so you'll still need that information eventually. Just want to warn you about that. The other thing I want to talk real quickly about the dates on your resume is when you use a month and year format, I would strongly encourage you to use a 2-digit month / 4-digit year format every time, because if you don't, maybe one job you have a 2-digit month like December, and then the next job you're showing a 1-digit month like February, And if you don't put 0, 2, if you just, instead of 2, your columns will no longer line up. If you're always using a 2-digit / 4-digit, your columns will always line up evenly. The other quick thing I want to share, remember a minute ago or so, I mentioned that personally I don't like to use city and state location for the employers in my work history on a resume unless I can figure out a way that it really serves a purpose to do so. One of the main reasons I don't like to do that is it's going to just clutter it up. Like if I were to use the city and state on this resume, I'd probably have to put it like right here underneath each of the dates. And every city is going to have a different amount of characters in it, so it's going to screw up my nice even margin. The other place I could potentially put it is like right after the employer name, but it would also add a lot more clutter. That's the reason I don't prefer to do it. But to each his own. So on a chronological resume, you guys, it would be ideal if when you're talking about the things that you've done, learned, and accomplished on a job, you can focus on some things that would relate to the job that you're applying for. And in this case, this person pulls it off quite nicely. Also, here's a little trick. They happen to have 2 jobs that were with certain companies, certain employers, but they were through a local staffing agency. The staffing agency signed their paycheck, not the company that they worked at. So by putting it on the resume in this format, like they worked at name of the employer, which I have employer C, but you would use the actual name, via name of the staffing company that you were employed by. That's the proper way to show a new potential employer that you worked at this site, but you were employed through this agency. So that's a little tip that some of you might want to use. Remember I was talking about the parentheses? They wanted to show that this was a temporary assignment, even though they were there for a decent amount of time. It was considered a temp assignment. If I scroll down, we got this person's education on here. Personally, I like to just italicize the name of the education, whether it's a GED or a diploma or an associate degree of some sort. They list the name of the high school. They could have put in parentheses a date after here, but remember that will sort of tell us approximately how old they are. In this case, the person chose to leave that off. Now, one of the downfalls typically of a chronological resume, because it's so heavy on the work history and what you've done on these jobs, it doesn't leave you a whole lot of room, unless you've only had one job or so, to talk about your skills, your abilities, your qualifications. So if you guys recall, I asked you whenever possible to try to offer some elaboration, some examples on some of these things, especially the self-management characteristics. Self-motivated, quick learner, team player, punctual, efficient. This person didn't do that. They didn't have the space. They didn't want to go to like a page and a quarter. So that's sort of not a good look. Like I would prefer those things to have examples because they don't carry very much weight at all, just like this. The employer has to choose to believe you, which we talked about that. Most employers, they don't know you. They're not going to automatically believe you. They might pick that other resume that has all the examples that they can sink their teeth into. Also, I put this on here. This is sort of a leftover from the past. Back when I first started this, a lot of people, everybody, not a lot, everybody put references available upon request. Nowadays, employers are just assuming that if they ask for a reference, assuming the employer is still in business, that you can get them one. So you do not need this on your resume nowadays. I just wanted to kind of show you what it used to look like and bring it up as a talking point. So that's the example of a potential chronological resume. I would also remind you that this format is sort of the format that I've evolved to using over the course of 20-some years of doing this. This is not the be-all, end-all format for a chronological resume. You're going to see a ton of them. Doesn't really matter what you do as long as I would want you to have a lot of margins and white space so it's not super cluttered. Hopefully you would agree that this resume is fairly easy on the eyes. I think it could be improved by the use of some bold or different fonts. I'm going to show you some other examples that have that on there, so you can decide for yourself if it helps it or if it doesn't. The next example I'm going to show you is an example of a functional resume. You'll notice that I put the full address in here. Once again, as I said before, that's not necessary in this day and time. You could choose to just have the city and state if you wanted, or you could not have that at all, like the previous resume did. It has a phone number, it has an email address, it has a sales pitch rather than an objective. In this case, I bolded accounting clerk. We talked about their experience in certain duties that their new potential employer that they're sending this to will hopefully appreciate. Otherwise, I didn't do my job right. We should have changed it to something else. But they mentioned that they have 4.5 years of experience in bank reconciliation, payroll and sales reports, general ledger, and more. Possess strong clerical and computer skills as well as valid driver license and reliable transportation. Once again, I will point out that to do this properly, I'm going to want examples for their strong clerical and computer skills down here somewhere. Otherwise, the employer has to just take your word for it. So this is the sales pitch rather than the objective. Remember, I mentioned a couple times earlier about subheadings. This is an example of that. We have a heading under experience. Well, we have experience, and then we have a subheading called accounting clerk, and we talk about some specific skills, abilities, things that they can offer in terms of accounting clerk. And then we have a couple bullets for a subheading called other qualifications. This is a format that I'll use, or clients will use from time to time. I find it sometimes makes it easier to write a resume, especially when you're doing a functional resume. The other reason that this is done like this is because, not so much in this case because of their work history, they've only had one main job. But if this person would have had multiple jobs in accounting and we didn't use a subheading like this and we used a functional resume, we would have to basically, every bullet point that we talk about, we would have to say what employer it was from. Whereas on a subheading, we could say if they did have multiple employers for the same type of job, we could say accounting clerk, and then in parentheses, name the employers, 2 or 3 of them, however many it was. And then we talk about what they learned in those employers, and it prevents us from having to say where these skill qualification bullet points came from on a functional resume. So if you look at these bullets, unlike the last resume that you saw from me, these have certain keywords that are bolded. So if I'm one of those employers that is only spending 6 or 15 seconds looking at a resume initially before I decide if it's going to go in the short stack or not, these bold words help me to get the most out of the resume and these underline words in a short amount of time. So if I'm skimming this, I'm hopefully at least seeing bank reconciliation, confidential reports, general ledger, safeguarded funds, office duties, administrative, company expenses. So, and if I'm seeing those things, they better be important, which is my way of saying, make sure anything you're bolding is very, very important. Otherwise, it shouldn't be bolded. It shouldn't be highlighted like that. Work history. This person, like I said, only had one employer, and in this employer, they had 3 different jobs within this employer. This is just, I wanted to illustrate that as a way to share with you how you could potentially list something like that on your resume. So they showed the timeline within the overall timeline for each job. Remember I said if you wanted to, you could use Homemaker to fill a gap on your resume. So this person hadn't had a job since July of 18, but by using Homemaker from July of 18 to present, they successfully filled that gap. This is another technique that I've come up with clients through the years. Rather than leave an employer hanging, if we didn't have this on there, this employer might think, well, they've been a Homemaker since July of 18. How do I know they're ready to get back to work, and do they have childcare and all that? So it could be, I'm not saying it always would be, but it could be a potential red flag in an employer's mind. So to alleviate that red flag, we just have a little asterisk, and we chose to put childcare in place, ready to re-enter the workforce. Just an idea if you want to use it. I know that some workforce development experts would say, well, you don't want to draw attention to the fact that you have a child. I'm sort of a different school of thought, and I'm just trying to share with the employer. I'm trying to fill your gap, and I'm trying to tell the employer, listen, I'm ready to re-enter the workforce. Personally, I'm not going to judge someone because they have a child. Most of our employees have children. But it's your call to make. You want to use whatever situation you feel is going to be right for you if you are in that situation. The next section that we have on this resume is education. Remember I said I like to, if you have some college, I like to show how many credit hours, and this is the way I choose to do it. You don't have to do it just like that. This person has 53 credit hours, associate degree in accounting is pending. You would insert the name of the school they're attending. We put a little sub-bullet. It looks different than the round bullet, but it doesn't have to. It could be a round circle if you chose. Expected graduation, summer 2021. Diploma from such and such high school. I should point out that in the education section, once you attain a college degree, if you're going to choose to show it on your resume, you can lose the diploma or GED and just use the space for something else. Notice this person did not put references available on request because it's no longer needed in this day and age. Before I move on to a different example, I just want to point out that earlier in this training, I pointed out that when I show you how to do a resume, especially a functional resume like this, remember I said it allows you to sort of, everything you put on it serves a purpose, right? There's no fat. It trims off all the fat. So literally, when we look at this resume and the others that I'm going to show you, every single bullet on this resume is a reason that they're qualified for this type of job. If you recall, remember those 3 potential interview questions I shared with you? I said, if you do your resume right, every single bullet on your resume is going to be a potential answer to those interview questions. This resume is literally a cheat sheet for this person's interview, and that's a good thing. The third resume example I'm going to give you is also an example of a functional resume, except it's for a cook. We looked at this sort of sales pitch earlier in the training. I don't like these check marks personally, but I wanted to include them to show you that a bullet fragment doesn't necessarily have to have that round bullet in there. Bullets can look different. If it was my resume, I wouldn't use this, but it's not a deal breaker. I'm not going to throw this resume in the shredder just because it has check marks and not circles. So this resume I want to provide as an example because it's an example of a resume where this person is applying for a job, culinary arts, a cook job, that they've never really done as a paid job. I mean, a little bit, and notice we use experience instead of work history. It's interchangeable, whatever you prefer. This person had a little bit of experience, like doing some cooking as a direct care worker, but for the most part, their work history is anything but a cook. So if they were to use a chronological resume, we would have bullet points after these. And in most cases, the bullet points that we have would not be relevant to the target of our resume, in this case, a cook. We would be wasting space. That's why earlier on, I told you that a lot of people who use a chronological resume make that mistake. So this is an example of someone who really almost all of their qualifications come from their education. Now, we could have put these bullets in the education section, but we chose to highlight them in the qualifications. But they almost all came from education. So they're certified in culinary arts through 2.5 years of training. And we talked about the skills that they developed at the externships with the couple restaurants that they did. And once again, I edited out names, so you would fill in the blanks for the name of the employers. Able to design creative plate presentations and garnishes. trained in following recipes using strict guidelines, cuts, amounts, etc. Very aware of the importance of food costs. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Licensed in first aid and CPR, that's the example I shared with you earlier when we were talking about value-added skills. And then they didn't just stop there. They gave a full example of how this could potentially benefit the restaurant that they're applying to. Now, so once again, don't forget when you create your qualification bullets or your skill bullets, you want to choose from those 4 categories I shared with you earlier. You could rewind and look at them. You could take a photo if you need to. You could take notes. But some of these are going to be job related. Some of these are going to be value added, like this one. Some of these are going to be transferable. And occasionally some of these are going to be self-management characteristics. In this case, I don't think there's none on this particular resume, but you'll see some soon. So most of these are job related. Job related, except it came from their education, not from any past employment history. Job related, value added. You don't have to have it to be a cook, but because she does, it's going to give her like an edge over her competition. This one as well, like if she's applying for a line cook position, prep cook and line cook in most restaurants are 2 different jobs. Because she's done prepping as part of her education and her externships, this is sort of a value-added skill as well. Unless the job description specifically talked about it, then it would be job-related. This is another value-added skill. Usually the manager of a restaurant takes care of this stuff, the inventory, the counting, the ordering. But because she's learned how to do that, she could be more than just a cook for this employer. They could see that from her resume that they could potentially eventually train her to be the next kitchen manager. This one right here and this one I want to talk a little bit about. These 2 are prime examples of heeding the advice that I gave earlier of thinking like an employer. As you're creating your resume, think to yourself and do your homework and ask questions of people that are in the industry. What is the employers in this particular industry really, really looking for? What is going to separate you from the rest of your competition? And those of you watching this video that have worked restaurant jobs, you guys may know, especially if you've been in management, that food cost, like you live and die by your food costs. If you're a manager and your food cost is sky high, that means profits are lower. You're probably not going to last too long, and you're certainly not going to be getting any bonuses. Whereas if you're a manager and your food cost is under control, your profit margin's higher and your chance of getting a bonus is a lot better. Most cooks that apply for a cooking job that I've seen aren't even considering something so vitally important as food costs. It's sort of, oftentimes it's just above their head. They've never really stopped or needed to consider it. So this person, in developing her resume, we wanted to go there. She was aware of it due to her schooling and training and externships. And as I interviewed her to do the resume, this came out. And after I helped her with this one, she thought of this one on her own, where she was talking about when she was doing the externships with these 2 employers during her program. She played a lead and support role in 2 government health inspections. And those of us that have ever worked restaurant know that that's huge. Like if you fail your health inspection, you're shut down for a while, and people could be fired. So once again, this is an example of thinking outside the box, thinking like an employer. Most cooks I know wouldn't even think to put this type of stuff on the resume. This is going to show the employer that she's thinking like management. She's thinking like the restaurant owner would think. She is, hopefully it makes her appear extra qualified for this job. And once again, this is just like the last resume I showed you. This resume is literally a cheat sheet for an interview. Every single qualification bullet on this resume can be used to answer those questions. Why are you qualified? Why should I hire you over someone else? This is what I meant, again, by earlier when I said I would teach you how to do a strong functional resume that's going to just trim off all the fat. Everything on this resume, literally everything, serves a purpose. You'll notice under the experience or work history that some of these jobs aren't relevant to the cooking position that she's trying for, but you still want to show your work history because having a job especially for a certain amount of time, shows that you were reliable enough to hold down employment. You're not a new worker. So if you have it, you want to show it. What I meant earlier when I said this functional resume lets you have your cake and eat it too, is in part it still lets you show your full work history, but you're not going into detail with bullet points for each of your jobs like you would on a chronological resume, when most of what you would talk about has nothing to do with the job that you're trying to use this resume for. Instead, you're drawing anything from your education, from any job you've ever had, and if it falls into one of those skill categories I shared with you, it's gonna appear up here in the qualifications section, which is the heart and soul of a functional resume. Remember, the heart and soul of a chronological resume is this work history or experience section. All right, one other example of another functional resume. This one I'm pretty proud of, and I wanted to show it to you as an example of, I get a lot of questions of how do I create a resume and apply and have a realistic chance of being hired for a job that I've never done before. Maybe I want to get into a new career field, or maybe I just don't have much experience. In this case, this person wanted to just a total career change. This is a functional resume. They put I have the full address, which you don't need. I want to point this out. This wasn't my idea. This was my client's idea, and I love it. They had an email address, and I can't remember if it was maybe unprofessional or if it was professional, but they didn't want to use it. But what they wanted to do is they created a brand new email address that it was actually specific to the job title that they were trying to get with a local cable company. Normally we actually had the name of the cable company in here, but I edited it for this example. So this is sort of a creative idea that I've only seen one person do that I wanted to share with you as an idea, especially for those of you that need to create a different email address. But even if you don't need to, you still may want to do something like this. So feel free to steal that. So this person couldn't come up with a sales pitch. They sort of did, it looks like a sales pitch, but it reads like an objective. And I just wanted to include it as an example because I wanted you to see a bunch of different kinds of examples. While this is not the best look like a proper sales pitch could be, I still think it's better than your average job objective. And they wanted to point out that they're interested in making a career change, so that was important to them. Now, before we get to the highlight of this resume, I want to go down here and show you they have an employment history and an education section. If we were fighting for space, I would call this work history, and I would only use one line. As we used 2 lines by doing it this way, but we didn't need the space. If you look at this person's employment history, they were a delivery driver for a certain company. They had 3 glazer jobs. Now, if you don't know what a glazer is, it's a union position. It's sort of like a glass worker. They install and repair windows and a lot of commercial stuff. So that's the job they had for most of their work history. Then they had a delivery driver for a local beverage company. But they wanted to get a field tech position, an installer position with a cable company. So this person has 0 job-related experience in that. Yet, when we sat down for about an hour or two where I interviewed him and I asked those questions and we drilled down, we were able to come up with so many transferable skills that I was so impressed with how this turned out. So I'm not going to read through every one of these for you, but I encourage you to maybe pause the video and look through these, because what you're going to see is every single one of these bullets on this resume is a really, really good qualification, a reason that this cable company would want to interview and hopefully hire this person for an installer, a field tech type of job. But yet, he never ever worked as a cable installer in his life. We took all this as, almost all this was transferable skills from his other jobs, or from just personal experience too, it could be. Yeah, these were all from jobs. You could use personal experience though if you could back it up with examples. So take a look at that at your leisure. It might give you some ideas on how to maybe create a resume to get a job that you've never done before and just focus on transferable skills rather than job-related skills like most people use. I got one last example for you before we go back to the PowerPoint. This one is an example of a hybrid resume, or what some people would call a combo or a combination resume. Notice on this resume, unlike the others, the other resumes I'm using more of a horizontal header. That saves space. This one is a vertical header. It kind of pushes everything down. This client didn't need they had more space than they could fill, so we chose to do it like that. You want to use whatever one's going to be most advantageous to you. And remember, you don't need necessarily this unless you want it, and this. So this, I included this on purpose. It's not the best example, but this person tried to come up with a sales pitch and sort of, they made it look like it, but it's not a sales pitch. It's an objective. It's an objective sort of worded to look like a sales pitch. I also, she didn't have it like this, but I purposely bolded everything just to show you don't do that. That's sort of overkill, and once again, it defeats the purpose of using that special font. We would only probably want sales associate bolded in this example. Now, one thing I like about this though, she specifically included the name of the employer that she was applying for. And that's an example, it's one easy example of customizing your resume, not only for a job, but for a particular employer. So this could easily be edited. If you were looking for this same type of job at multiple clothing or retail employers, you could use this resume and then just before you send it out to each place, just change this name. Save it at, instead of saving it as Janie Doe Macy's resume, you would then save it as Janie Doe JCPenney resume, or whatever store you're using. So this is a functional resume. This is a hybrid resume. So notice they have what would fall under chronological and what would fall under functional. They kind of got both. This wouldn't be usable if you had a whole lot of work history, because it would be too long too quickly. Notice they used an 11-point font. You can kind of see it up here. So that's the smallest I would ever want to go on a resume. They made this a little bigger, 14. The name is a little bigger. So one other thing about this resume I want to point out in terms of what not to do. Hopefully I've sort of sold you guys on the importance of using bold or underlined font to make things stand out. If you recall from the previous examples, or if you want to go back and look at them again, I'm hoping you'll agree with me in saying that those examples are much more easier on the eyes, easier to get through in a short amount of time and pick out key information than this one is when we didn't use that technique. So hopefully you guys will choose to use that little tip on your own resumes to make it more likely to get in that short stack I spoke about earlier. But if you want to pause and kind of look through these examples of qualifications, it will give you some ideas on, how to develop a customized resume and qualifications for, sales, retail type of job. I also want to point out that we didn't just say fast learner. We kind of gave examples. So that's an example of what to do, rather than what your competition is going to do and just talk about being a fast learner. This gives you an edge over that competition. All right, I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint now. And I want to start wrapping this up by giving you some extra tips to kind of help perhaps separate you from your competition. One technique that I've had clients use with some success is to incorporate a reference letter quote into the resume. So what gave me the idea of doing this is we had a client who went to a 2-page resume because they had some important things we didn't want to leave off. But they ended up with like a 1 and a little over a half pages. So we had a bunch of empty space at the end of our second page. So what we did on that, she happened to be able to get a quote from an employer, a previous employer, and we inserted this quote into the, actually it turns out it wasn't, it was a male client, not a Jane Doe. It should have been a John Doe. But I edited the name for you. And we inserted this to the bottom of page 2 of the resume. So what this said should have been John Doe is a passionate IT professional with a diverse skill set. And then when you see the bracketed words, it means that we edited the quote kind of for readability. So that bracketed "and" wasn't in the original quote. We sort of put it in there to make it stick a little better. Also, when you see these little ... at the beginning, that's called an ellipsis. It's a Greek word meaning omission. And you want to use an ellipsis whenever you are sort of taking a quote but chopping it up and omitting, taking out some words, which you'll often have to do just to make it a little more readable when you use this technique. So this ended up saying, it should say, John Doe is a passionate IT professional with a diverse skill set and a strong knowledge level of microsystems in general. John is also knowledgeable in programming and systems security, which we wanted highlighted because it was sort of a value-added thing for the job that he was applying to, and is capable of learning anything it would have been he pursues in the real case. So then we finish it off with the name of the person, which I also edited, and the company, which I edited. The name, title, and company of the person who gave the quote. And in order for this to be most effective, you would want this to be someone that has a higher up job in the company that you used to work for. So I don't see this very often on resumes, but it's one thing, especially if you have a great relationship with a former boss or a couple of them, you could even do probably 2 of these quotes on a resume. I haven't done that yet, but it's not to say it couldn't be done. But so this is just an idea that you can take or leave as you see fit, and perhaps use it to fill in a resume that's a little short, or to just use it to, as an effective tool for impressing a potential employer. Real briefly, some of you may be on LinkedIn, and I understand there's something on LinkedIn called endorsements, where I've never done this technique, but I've thought about it, and you might be able to utilize your LinkedIn endorsements in a very similar way as the reference quote idea to kind of fill in some space on your resume. Something else to think about. I want to quickly give you all of my golden rules of resume development all together. So once again, you can come back and refer to them as you see fit, or you can take a picture. These are the rules that I have tended to live by over my 20+ years of resume writing experience. These are the rules that I train my staff to follow. Just remember, like I said at the start of this training, there's generally exceptions to almost every rule, and from time to time, there may even be exceptions to the golden rules that I'm about to show you. So if you're in our programs and you think you found an exception where to one of these golden rules where you might want to break it or need to break it, please discuss it with program staff, and they will help guide you on that. So rule number 1, you want to advertise your skills, your abilities, your experience, your training as applicable to the job, the position you're trying to land. So your resumes must be customized. They must be relevant to the job that you're looking for. Feel free to include anything and everything as long as it serves a purpose. Rule number 2, a well-written resume should be able to serve as a cheat sheet in preparing for an interview. So I showed you examples of how that would look. Every bullet on those functional resumes literally could be an answer to many of the questions you face in an interview. Rule number 3, for maximum effect, a resume should have an easy on the eyes, quick to read layout. To help make this happen, remember to use bulleted fragments, generous use of space and margins. Remember to avoid the use of I, me, my whenever possible to ensure you have fragments rather than complete sentences. I'll be honest with you, once in a while I might throw an I, me, or my on a resume, but it's 99.9% of the time it's going to be found in the sales pitch just because I have to make it kind of word it properly, but I don't want to do it whenever I can help it. Rule number 4, a candidate's key experience and skills should always go forward towards the top of the resume. Underneath your personal information, such as your header, like your name, your email address, and such, in the form of a sales pitch. And if that's not possible, or if you're just simply not willing to put the time and effort that it takes to get a good sales pitch developed, then at the very least, you need to customize your job objective and not make one of those mistakes I showed you earlier. Rule number 5 has to do with font size. We mentioned this earlier. I'm just recapping. You want to try to stick to 12 and 11 point font with exceptions here or there for certain headings. You want to try to limit yourself to 1 page, but if you need to go to 2 pages, it's perfectly acceptable to avoid leaving off important and relevant qualifications. Just make sure that that second page is just absolutely necessary. Also, make sure there's nothing you can do with formatting to kind of fit. If you just have like a quarter of a page for the second page, we can usually format your resume to kind of increase the margins and fit that all onto 1 page. Rule number 6, if you're using a chronological style resume, please take care to avoid repetition and irrelevancy. In my opinion, you guys, like I said before, creating a resume for a staffing agency is generally among the only time you might break this rule. Rule 7, be aware of the risks of being potentially viewed as under or overqualified or interested in a different line of work, and customize your resume accordingly. 8, consider the 4 types of qualifications that I showed you earlier when building your resume. No matter what style you're using, chronological, functional, hybrid, you want to consider your job-related qualifications, your transferable, your value-added, and those self-management characteristics or qualifications that we talked about and I showed you some examples of earlier. Feel free to, when you're creating your resume, feel free to look back on those for some extra help. Rule 9, for anything on a resume, ask yourself, does it serve a purpose or is it just taking up space? If it's just taking up space without serving a purpose, it doesn't belong on the resume. So an example of that would have been how many people put the city and state under each of their job histories. I don't think it usually serves a purpose. Rule 10, proofread, proofread, proofread. You don't want any mistakes on your resume. Make sure you have an extra set of eyes or 2 or 3 on your resume, because I often see that there's a mistake that maybe one person doesn't catch and the next person does, or 2 people don't catch it and the third person does. Here's some common mistakes. Spelling errors. Don't just rely on Microsoft Word to spell check, you guys. I've seen so many times where maybe someone had an actual word that was spelled correctly, but they meant to spell a completely different word. So when you read their skill bullet, it made 0 sense. Don't attempt a one-size-fits-all approach. I can't tell you how many job seekers I've worked with in my 20-some years of doing this that literally thought they could get away with, having one resume. It's always a danger sign when someone says to me, "Oh, I already have a resume." Well, in order to really say that, that means they're only looking for one very specific kind of job. Then it's okay to say, "I already have a resume." But if you're the type of person, as many people are, where you're looking for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different kind of jobs, I hate to break it to you, but you already know it by now if you've stuck around this long. You need 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different resumes. Don't make the mistake that I showed you early on in this training called, it's the one I called the TMI, the too much information, or the too vague objective, if you choose to use a job objective. Another mistake I see a lot is a lack of descriptions or examples within that bulleted content. We talked about that earlier. Inaccurate information. You want to make sure everything is accurate, because I have had cases of people being caught in lies, whether accidental or on purpose, when they get to an interview. So you want to make sure your resume is 100% factually honest and accurate, so it will steer you straight every time. Another mistake that often is made is listing jobs which yield poor or no references. Once again, there may be times when this is unavoidable and you might want to take a gamble on it. As I mentioned earlier, if you're in that situation, be sure to talk to a program staff member if you're in one of our programs. They'll sort of be able to coach you and guide you on what the best situation is for you. Not using the proper resume for the job is a mistake that I see a lot. Coming off as over or underqualified, I see that one a lot. Writing a book, I shared with you at the beginning, where those resumes are not going to have a really high chance of being kept and really looked at by most employers. They just simply don't have the time. Don't make the mistake of failing to alleviate any red flags that come up on a resume. So when you have your resume in front of you and when it's kind of done, you want to think about it from an employer's perspective. So once again, I shared before the example of if you were only on the job for 3 months, but it was a genuine temporary assignment, or a seasonal assignment, make sure you flag that after the job title and put seasonal or temporary. You want to make sure you're trying to do your best to eliminate any potential red flags that come up when an employer reads that resume. Don't make the mistake of not seeing the big picture and failing to think like an employer when creating your resume. I should mention that a resume is never done. I guess the only time it would be done is if you get to the point where you retire or you win the lottery and you never have to work a day again in your life. Otherwise, you're probably going to be using the resume here and there throughout your life. And I do realize there's exceptions to that rule. There are some jobs that they don't even care about a resume. They don't even look at them. But most people will be using resumes. So when I say big picture, think back to the examples I showed you about that cook resume where they focused on food cost and ordering inventory and health inspections and all that. Most cooks don't think about that, but she did, and it got her a lot of interviews and a job. Some other advice on that last one is to interview people that are in that line of work to kind of see what the big picture might be. Or if you're in one of our Michigan Works programs, our staff can help you with some career exploration or some ways to kind of research that yourself. Rule number 11, never under any circumstances copy and paste information from websites or job descriptions onto your resume. You can use those to your advantage. They're great resources for helping you generate ideas for your resume, but the content itself is typically not written in a way on those websites or job postings where you can just copy and paste it. And I can't tell you how many clients I see that do that. And when you read their resume, almost any employer can tell in an instant that they really didn't write that resume. It's literally just like boilerplate language, and it's not a good look at all. So you also want your resume, like we've been talking about, is to be fleshed out with real life examples and talking points. So using the information from job descriptions in certain websites as is usually not suitable for your resume. It's usually not a good idea. I often get asked the question, how do I address a lack of skills or qualifications when I'm developing a resume? So we have some of the young professionals in our program will ask this question. And I do have answers for you, but I should warn you, unfortunately, none of these answers are a quick fix. So there are several options though. One of them is to volunteer. Now, we often get program participants who kind of say something to the effect of, I'm not working for free. Like, I don't want to volunteer because I need money. I'm not working for free. I hear you. I understand you. But at the same time, I would urge you to also think about it where when you volunteer for a job, you are getting paid. You're just not getting paid in cash money. You're getting paid in knowledge, information, skills to put on your resume, to grow your resume, to build a resume. You're getting paid if you play your cards right and you leave on good terms and you're a good volunteer worker. You're getting paid, and now you have the ability to use this person hopefully as a professional reference, which will help you in your job search. It will help you on your resume. Maybe you can get one of those good quotes from them that you can use on your resume. So volunteering is one avenue to sort of develop a resume and to get some skills and qualifications for a job that you currently don't have any skills for. The other one is if you are in our Young Professionals program, you may qualify for a paid work experience. We sometimes use that for individuals who don't have a lot of marketable skills to jump right into a job, or who want to explore some different career ideas. But if you do qualify, you can talk to program staff about that. We can get you some work experience where we'll pay you to gain those skills and to work for an employer. And then if you play your cards right, maybe you can get hired on permanently when the paid work experience is done. A third way that you can use to address a lack of skills or qualifications when creating a resume is through the use of community service or work experience. So some programs offer some things similar to that. And as a very last resort, there are times where I've run into clients who they just, not through no fault of their own, where they're at in life, they just don't have anything to put on a resume. If we were to create a resume for them sometimes, we would literally just have a name and a phone contact information and maybe a job objective. So if that's the case, there's nothing wrong with that. We've all been there in life, once during our life. So maybe you don't have a work history. You don't have a volunteer history that you can use to build a resume. You don't have any relevant education or training, because I remember I showed you that cook resume that almost everything on it was built through their education. You don't have any self-employment to speak of. What is the solution for that? Well, I can share with you, I have found some success in that situation where someone does not have anything to put on a resume, using a cover letter until such time as you have developed some skills to put on a resume. Now, a cover letter, you guys, we're going to have a whole nother video on that you'll be able to watch. Vicki will be doing that video. I just want to give you a little heads up that if you're in this situation, I've written a cover letter with clients where we've focused on the fact that we've let off on the letter that the client has no work experience. They haven't worked before. They're young. They're looking to get their first job, their first employer, and then we try to turn that apparent weakness into a strength. I remember we've mentioned in the past about how, we wrote a sentence or two about how since they haven't worked before, they're open to learning and being trained on the job the way their first employer wants to do things. They don't bring any bad habits or baggage from other places in. They're sort of like a blank slate. And then sometimes we're able to focus on if they can work any days or shifts and they have that flexibility, we can include that in the cover letter. If they have reliable transportation, we can mention that. So it's almost like in the cover letter, they're asking for a first opportunity and they're including whatever it is they could to help change that employer's mind and give them that first opportunity. So that's one idea as a last resort if you're at a point where you don't have anything to put on a resume. But trust me, it'll just be temporary. you will get to the point where you will have a half-page resume and then eventually a full-page resume, and then who knows, you'll be at a 2-page resume before you know it. So I hope I was of assistance with you. I know this was a long video. Hopefully you took it in stages. But you know you can come back to it anytime you want to help you either create a new resume or perfect or enhance a resume that you already have. If you are interested in learning more about our Young Professionals program and how we might be able to assist you in Macomb and St. Clair counties, please contact one of the office locations on the slide right there. And I just want to leave you all by saying that, as you probably already know, a resume is never finished. It's always a work in progress. So I've had clients where we've had a great resume. We were both happy with it. And I encourage them, though, to, as they're falling asleep at night, try to think of some other things that they might have forgot to talk about on their resume, very relevant, important things. Or obviously, as they grow and get new experiences in life, in their job, in their school, in their personal life, they will acquire new skills and qualifications. So that resume is never finished. You're always going to want to add new things to it. And you may you're going to hit a point where, especially if you have like one very full page, you're going to hit a point where you're going to want to update it, but you don't want to go to a page and then a little paragraph on a second page. So that's where these programs that Michigan Works have can be really helpful. You'll have some direct staff assistance that if you can get into one of these programs, especially our Young Professionals program, we have a very good team that are trained to help you out with things like that. All right, so good luck. I wish you the best in your job search, and I hope I was able to give you some really useful tips in creating or growing your resume. Thank you.